A thin line runs from a Victorian apothecary counter to the fentanyl crisis of today, and it was drawn the moment society decided pain should disappear quietly. In the 19th century, relief came wrapped in amber glass and polite assurances. Opium was sold without whispers, prescribed without fear, and taken with the same trust placed in gaslight and progress. It softened grief, calmed children, steadied nerves, and dulled the ache of bodies worn thin by industry. No alarms rang, no warnings followed. Dependence wore the mask of respectability, and chemistry was welcomed as a civilizing force. If this kind of history draws you in, take a moment to subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. These stories unfold best when shared in the quiet. But substances evolve faster than conscience. Laudanum hardened into morphine. Morphine refined itself into heroin. Heroin vanished behind laboratory doors and returned as something colder, stronger, and far less forgiving. Each era repeated the same mistake with better tools and greater certainty. What was once sipped beneath gaslight is now injected under fluorescent bulbs, guided by the same belief that relief can be separated from consequence. This is not the story of a sudden collapse. It is the slow inheritance of a choice made long ago when Victorian opium first promised comfort without cost, and no one asked what that promise would become. Pain, in Victorian Britain, was not merely a sensation, it was a failing, an untamed remainder of an older world that respectable society believed it was finally learning to correct. To suffer openly was to admit weakness of nerve, of character, of discipline. The century that wrapped itself in progress had little patience for bodies that resisted control. Steam engines obeyed pressure. Factories obeyed schedules. Cities bent themselves into grids of brick and gaslight. The human body, stubborn and unpredictable, was expected to follow. Pain that lingered, cried out, or disrupted order was treated not as a warning, but as an error. This belief did not announce itself cruelly. It arrived gently, clothed in language of care. Doctors spoke of relief as duty. Clergymen spoke of calm as virtue. Newspapers praised modern remedies as evidence that civilization had finally outgrown the barbarism of endurance. To feel less was to be better. To dull sensation was to refine it. Opium fit perfectly into this worldview. It did not demand attention. It did not stain the reputation of the home in which it was used. It arrived, dissolved, measured, polite, a liquid solution to a disorderly problem. Where pain once demanded acknowledgement, opium allowed it to recede quietly, compliantly, without forcing anyone to ask why it was there in the first place. In parlors and sick rooms, suffering became something to be corrected swiftly before it disrupted propriety. A mother's exhaustion, a laborer's aching joints, a widow's grief, none of these required examination. They required management. Relief was not framed as escape, but as responsibility. A household that allowed pain to linger was seen as negligent, just as a physician who failed to suppress symptoms risked appearing outdated, even cruel. This was the age of confidence in intervention. Pain had been tolerated for centuries. Now it could be softened, shortened, controlled. And control, in the Victorian mind, was always moral. A calm body suggested a disciplined soul. A sedated mind suggested stability. The quieter the suffering, the healthier the society appeared. What was never fully addressed was what this silence replaced. Pain had once served as a signal of injury, of overload, of grief too heavy to carry alone. But in an era obsessed with order, signals were inconvenient. They interrupted schedules. They challenged authority. They reminded observers that progress had limits. Opium did not argue. It erased the signal and left the system undisturbed. The notion that suffering could be eliminated without consequence felt not only hopeful, but righteous. The absence of immediate harm was taken as proof of success. Dependence was invisible at first, slow and private, unfolding behind closed doors. And because it did not resemble the vices of the poor or the criminal, it went unnamed. There was no category yet for a condition that grew from medical trust. Pain, redefined as something uncivilized, lost its legitimacy. To endure it was primitive. To speak of it too loudly was improper. The good citizen complied. The good patient swallowed. The good doctor prescribed. In this way, a cultural agreement formed quietly, without signatures. Pain would be subdued, not understood. Relief would be immediate, not interrogated. And chemistry would be allowed to do what conversation, reform, and rest could not. This agreement did not collapse overnight. It hardened. It passed itself down. What began as gentleness would later become efficiency. What was once liquid would become injectable. What soothed nerves would later command them entirely. But at the beginning, it felt like mercy. And that belief that pain itself was the enemy would shape everything that followed. It did not arrive disguised as danger. It arrived as decor. In Victorian homes, the opium bottle held no secrecy. It stood openly among household objects beside hair tonics, perfumes, cough syrups, and polished silver. Its glass was thick, often ambered, its label neat and reassuring. The stopper fit snugly, suggesting containment, control. Nothing about it hinted at excess. Nothing warned of consequence. It belonged, naturally, to the domestic sphere. This was medicine that did not disturb the household's moral geometry. It asked no questions, raised no voices, left no visible marks. A few drops before bed, a spoonful after supper. Relief measured not in transformation but in quiet. Pain softened, nerves settled, children slept, adults endured another day without complaint. The bottle did what was asked of it, and that obedience earned trust. Victorian domestic life prized calm above all else. The home was expected to function as a sanctuary from the industrial world, ordered, restrained, emotionally contained. Opium served this ideal flawlessly. It smoothed the sharp edges of fatigue and grief, ensuring that discomfort did not spill into public view. A woman managing a household could not afford visible distress. A man returning from labor was expected to recover quickly, silently, and be ready again by morning. Laudanum became a tool of maintenance. It preserved appearances. It kept routines intact. Its presence on the mantel was as unremarkable as a clock ticking through the evening. It marked time, not crisis. And because it worked, its use expanded not dramatically, but steadily, quietly, without debate. There was no ritual of secrecy surrounding its administration. Children received it for teething pains, for coughs, for restlessness. Infants were calmed with syruped doses that promised sleep. Mothers were encouraged, gently but firmly, to rely on it when exhaustion threatened their composure. In a society that measured virtue by restraint, opium offered a chemical means of compliance. What made this arrangement so enduring was not ignorance, but confidence. The Victorian age trusted labels, formulas, and authority. A substance sold by chemists and recommended by physicians carried legitimacy. It was regulated enough to feel safe, but common enough to feel familiar. No one suspected that familiarity itself could be dangerous. The bottle's placement mattered. It was not hidden in drawers or locked away. It sat within reach, within sight, reinforcing the idea that relief should be immediate. Pain did not need contemplation. It needed correction. The very accessibility of opium reshaped expectations. Discomfort was no longer something to be endured or explained. It was something to be removed. And yet, something subtle began to change within these homes. Relief shortened patience. The threshold for discomfort lowered. What had once been tolerable now demanded intervention. A headache, a restless night, a low mood, each found its answer more quickly than before. The body learned the language of chemical quiet, and it remembered, Dependence did not announce itself as craving. It emerged as routine. The bottle was reached for not because of desperation, but because it was there, because it had worked yesterday, because it preserved the household's fragile equilibrium. Over time, absence became noticeable not as withdrawal, but as inconvenience. Pain returned louder when silenced too often. Still, no alarm sounded. There was no collapse, no scandal. The bottle remained on the mantel, unchanged, respectable, approved. Its dangers were too gradual to compete with its usefulness, and usefulness, in a society devoted to order, outweighed abstract risk. The home, meant to be a refuge, had quietly become the first laboratory. Within its walls, a lesson was being taught, one that would echo far beyond Victorian parlors. Relief, when made ordinary, reshapes expectation, and when expectation changes, the body is never asked whether it consents. The bottle stayed, and with it, the belief that suffering should never interrupt the day. Trust in the Victorian age was not earned gradually. It was assumed. The physician entered a room carrying more than instruments and bottles. He carried authority, quiet, unquestioned, and deeply cultural. His words were not suggestions, they were assurances. When he spoke of remedies, they were received not as experiments, but as settled truth. Doubt, after all, was associated with ignorance, not caution. And to question medicine was to place oneself outside the forward march of progress. This was an era enthralled by systems. Railways ran on schedules. Factories operated by calculation. Chemistry transformed raw elements into predictable results. Medicine, eager to stand among these disciplines, adopted the same language of certainty. Symptoms were problems. Drugs were solutions. The human body became a mechanism whose disturbances could be corrected with sufficient precision. Opium thrived in this climate because it produced visible results quickly. Pain eased. Rest returned. Patients expressed gratitude. These outcomes reinforced belief, not inquiry. A treatment that worked immediately invited little scrutiny. Its success, measured in silence rather than cure, satisfied both patient and practitioner. Doctors did not see themselves as enablers of dependency. They saw themselves as agents of relief in a society increasingly intolerant of discomfort. Their role was not to explore suffering, but to suppress it efficiently. Time was limited. House calls were many. A medicine that calmed the body without complication was invaluable. Medical journals of the period reflected this confidence. They spoke of dosage, refinement, purity, but rarely of restraint. The conversation centered on effectiveness, not consequence. If a substance soothed nerves and reduced pain, it fulfilled its purpose. That its effects lingered beyond the initial ailment was regarded as incidental, even beneficial. A calm patient was a compliant patient. A compliant patient was a successful outcome. Suspicion had not yet found its place in the medical lexicon. Addiction, as a concept, lacked clarity. Excess was moralized when it appeared among the poor or the visibly intoxicated, but dependence emerging from prescription did not fit existing categories. It was too quiet, too orderly, too respectable. The doctor's authority extended beyond the clinic. His recommendations carried into the home, into daily routine, into moments of grief and fatigue. A prescription did not merely authorize, it normalized it. Once sanctioned, the substance ceased to be a choice. It became care. This dynamic created a subtle imbalance. Patients deferred not only treatment decisions, but bodily interpretation itself. Pain was no longer something to be understood by the individual. It was something to be managed externally. The body's complaints were translated into chemical terms, stripped of context, and resolved through dosage. In this arrangement, medicine became a mediator between society and discomfort. Its goal was not transformation, but stabilization. The absence of visible suffering signaled success, even if the cause remained untouched. And because opium excelled at producing this absence, it was rewarded with trust. There were voices that hesitated, physicians who noted tolerance, who observed patients returning too often, who wondered at the restlessness that followed missed doses. But these observations struggled to find traction. They conflicted with the dominant narrative of progress. To acknowledge risk would have required slowing down, questioning success, and reconsidering authority itself. Instead, medicine advanced with confidence intact. Refinement continued, measurements improved, delivery methods evolved, and the assumption remained that chemistry, when guided by professional hands, could not betray its purpose. This absence of suspicion was not ignorance, it was faith. Faith in systems, in expertise, in the idea that modernity itself was a safeguard. Pain had been mastered, relief had been professionalized, and the possibility that the solution might carry its own danger was simply not compatible with the worldview of the time. So medicine proceeded, calm and assured, unaware that the very trust placed in it would become one of its most enduring vulnerabilities. Motherhood, in the Victorian imagination, was meant to be instinctive, serene, and endlessly resilient. A woman was expected to absorb exhaustion without protest, to meet grief with composure, and to maintain order even as her body was steadily depleted. Any deviation from this ideal was treated not as strain, but as failure of nerve. Laudanum offered correction. It entered the maternal sphere quietly, presented not as indulgence, but as aid. Physicians spoke of it gently, almost kindly, a few drops to settle the nerves, a measured spoonful to restore sleep. Relief was framed as practical, even responsible. A mother who rested was a better mother. A calm household was a moral success. No one lingered over what that calm required. Victorian motherhood unfolded within relentless repetition. Pregnancy, childbirth, loss, and labor stacked one upon another without pause. Infant mortality was common. Miscarriage was endured privately. Recovery was brief, if it existed at all. Pain was expected, but not to the point of disruption. A mother was meant to continue. Laudanum made continuation possible. For women whose days were structured by constant demand, the drug functioned as an invisible assistant. It softened the ache in the back, the weight in the chest, the agitation that followed sleepless nights. It slowed the racing thoughts that came after loss. It blurred the edges of fear. In doing so, it preserved appearances, and appearances were everything. The dosage was small at first, always small at first. The language of medicine emphasized moderation, precision, control. This was not intoxication, this was balance. A chemical adjustment to restore order where biology had failed to cooperate. Children, too, became recipients. Laudanum was administered to quiet infants who cried too long, who slept too little, who strained the limits of maternal endurance. It was framed as kindness to the child and to the mother. A sleeping infant was a healthy infant. A silent nursery was a successful one. What was not spoken aloud was how easily the boundary between treatment and reliance dissolved. Relief, once experienced, recalibrated expectation. The return of unfiltered sensation felt sharper than before. Fatigue grew heavier, anxiety louder. The mother reached again for the bottle, not because she was reckless, but because she was responsible. She had learned what calm felt like, and calm was now part of her duty. Laudanum did not create dependence through indulgence. It created it through expectation. The cultural pressure placed upon women ensured that few questioned this arrangement. A mother admitting distress risked judgment. A mother seeking rest risked appearing unfit. Laudanum offered a solution that required no confession. It allowed women to endure silently, which society interpreted as strength. Physicians rarely saw the full picture. They observed calmer patients, quieter homes, fewer complaints. These outcomes reinforced confidence. The medicine worked, the household functioned. There was no visible harm, demanding intervention. But inside these homes, tolerance grew. Dosages crept upward, unnoticed. The body adapted, requiring more to achieve the same effect. When laudanum was absent, discomfort returned not merely as pain, but as agitation and unease difficult to name. Mothers described it as nerves, restlessness, weakness. The solution, once again, was offered in drops. This cycle did not attract scandal. It unfolded too privately, too slowly. Dependence wore the mask of virtue. A woman who relied on laudanum was not viewed as fallen or immoral. She was seen as coping. In this way, Victorian society taught an enduring lesson: that care could be chemical, that endurance could be manufactured, and that the costs of such arrangements need not be examined if the surface remained orderly. Laudanum did not liberate mothers from suffering. It made suffering quieter, and quiet, in that era, was indistinguishable from health. The factory did not ask whether the body was willing. It asked only whether it could continue. Victorian industry moved with an appetite that outpaced flesh. Machines ran longer than daylight. Shifts stretched past exhaustion. The rhythm of labor was no longer set by seasons or strength, but by profit and pressure. The body, once a measure of work, became an obstacle to its aching joints, trembling hands, minds dulled by repetition. Pain was inefficient. Fatigue was waste. Opium offered a solution that did not interfere with production. It entered the industrial world not as a luxury, but as a lubricant, a way to keep men standing, moving, enduring. A few drops before a shift, a dose after an injury. Relief that arrived without rest, without pause, without concession to the body's limits. The promise was simple: work could continue. Employers did not distribute opium openly, but its presence was understood. Chemists near factories did steady business. Physicians treating injured workers reached for remedies that quieted pain without requiring time off. The expectation was clear: the body would be managed chemically when it failed mechanically. In this environment, suffering lost its legitimacy entirely. An aching back was not a warning, it was a nuisance. A crushed finger was not a reason to stop, it was a problem to be muted. Opium did not heal injuries. It rendered them irrelevant, at least temporarily, and temporary was enough. The working class learned quickly what the drug could offer. It was not pleasure they sought, but survival. Relief allowed them to return to the floor, to the loom, to the press. It allowed wages to continue, families to be fed. Pain became something to negotiate, not avoid, and opium became the currency of that negotiation. What made this arrangement especially durable was its invisibility. The worker who swallowed laudanum did not appear drunk. He did not stagger or shout. He worked. He complied. He endured. His suffering did not disrupt order, and so it went unchallenged. Industry praised resilience without acknowledging its cost. Newspapers admired the fortitude of laborers. Reformers focused on wages and hours, rarely on what sustained endurance chemically. The body's compliance was mistaken for strength, when it was often sedation. As tolerance grew, so did reliance. Injuries that once would have demanded rest now required stronger doses. Pain dulled, but the damage accumulated beneath it. The body learned to function in spite of itself, propped up by chemistry rather than care. There was no collective reckoning. The industrial machine valued output, not longevity. A worker who broke could be replaced. A bottle that kept him functional was far more efficient than reform. Opium's role in this system was never officially acknowledged, but it was deeply embedded. It softened the human cost of progress just enough to allow it to continue unchecked. It made exploitation sustainable. This, too, was framed as necessity. Industry demanded productivity, and productivity demanded relief. The chain of reasoning felt inevitable. Pain was incompatible with progress. Therefore, pain must be subdued. The tragedy lay in how quietly this logic spread. Relief was no longer exceptional, it was structural. The body was expected to be adjustable. If it failed, chemistry would intervene. If chemistry failed, stronger chemistry would follow. In the shadow of factories and foundries, a lesson was being reinforced, that pain had no place in modern life, and that its removal was worth any unseen cost. The machines did not slow, and neither did the medicine that kept men standing before them. Calm, once a state of mind, became a measurable outcome. Victorian science prized what could be observed, repeated, and controlled. A patient who slept was a success. A room that fell quiet signaled resolution. Chemistry, newly empowered by laboratories and formulas, promised something older remedies never could: consistency. Where rest depended on circumstance and conversation demanded time, a compound delivered results on demand. Opium's greatest appeal was not its strength, but its predictability. It worked the same way across bodies, across classes, across circumstances. It slowed breath, softened sensation, smoothed emotion into something manageable. In an age uneasy with unpredictability, this reliability felt revolutionary. Physicians began to speak not just of relief, but of regulation. The nervous system was no longer mysterious, it was chemical. Anxiety became overstimulation, grief became imbalance, sleeplessness became malfunction. Each condition implied a correctable error, and each correction suggested mastery. Calm was no longer earned through reflection or recovery, it was administered. This shift altered how distress was understood. Emotional pain, once interpreted through personal or social lenses, was increasingly treated as a mechanical fault. If the mind faltered, chemistry would intervene. If the body resisted, chemistry would insist. The human experience was reframed as a series of adjustable variables. The language surrounding opium reflected this transformation. It was not intoxicating, it was soothing, not numbing, balancing, not suppressive, restorative. These words mattered. They placed the drug within the realm of improvement rather than escape. Calm became a product of progress, not a byproduct of patience. What made this chemistry especially seductive was its apparent cleanliness. No smoke, no ritual, no visible excess. The calm it produced was tidy, efficient, compatible with polite society. A person under its influence did not withdraw from life. They participated more smoothly. They spoke less, demanded less, felt less. This reduction was mistaken for health. The body, however, registered the change differently. Neural pathways adapted. Tolerance emerged quietly, unnoticed by those measuring success in silence. The chemistry that once produced calm began to require reinforcement. Dosage increased incrementally, always justified. The goal remained the same: equilibrium. Few questioned whether this equilibrium was natural or sustainable. As chemistry advanced, confidence grew. Laboratories refined compounds. Measurements became more precise. Variability diminished. The belief took hold that science could improve upon nature itself. If calm could be engineered, why tolerate unrest? If pain could be subdued chemically, why endure it socially? This logic spread beyond medicine. Schools valued quiet children. Workplaces valued compliant employees. Homes valued peace above all. Chemistry offered a universal solution to human friction. And yet, the calm it produced was not neutral. It shaped behavior. It softened resistance. It discouraged confrontation not just with pain, but with conditions that caused it. The chemical answer arrived so quickly that the question was never asked. Over time, the absence of distress became an expectation rather than a gift. Any return of sensation felt abnormal, even threatening. The body, once accustomed to chemical calm, protested when it was withheld. This protest was misinterpreted as illness rather than adjustment. The solution, predictably, was more chemistry. Thus, calm ceased to be a state achieved through balance or understanding. It became a baseline enforced through intervention. The nervous system was no longer trusted to regulate itself. It was managed. In this way, Victorian society did more than adopt a drug, it adopted a philosophy, one that treated discomfort as malfunction, emotion as error, and chemistry as correction. The calm was real, but so was the cost of requiring it. Grief, in the Victorian world, was expected to be borne quietly. Loss was common: children, spouses, parents taken by illness, accident, or time with such frequency that mourning threatened to become constant. Yet society demanded restraint. Public displays of sorrow were governed by etiquette. Black clothing had its rules. Duration had its limits. Tears, like pain, were to be managed. Opium offered assistance where language failed. It did not erase grief, but it blunted its sharpest edges. It dulled the weight that pressed on the chest in the early hours of morning. It slowed the racing thoughts that arrived at night, when distractions fell away. Physicians described it as easing the nerves, calming the heart, restoring sleep. These were practical goals in a society that valued function over expression. For the bereaved, this chemical softening felt like mercy. A widow was expected to continue oversee a household, raise children, preserve dignity. A father was expected to return to work, provide, and not be undone by loss. Opium made these expectations achievable. It allowed grief to be folded inward, rendered private, transformed from an overwhelming force into a manageable condition. But grief, unlike pain from injury, carries meaning. It signals rupture. It demands reckoning. By softening it too quickly, Victorian society learned to bypass that reckoning altogether. Mourning became something to be endured efficiently. The goal was not understanding, but stabilization. The bereaved were praised for composure, not honesty. Those who struggled were offered remedies, not conversation. The implication was subtle but clear. Prolonged grief was unnecessary, even improper. Laudanum became a companion in these moments, not always daily, not always heavily, but reliably. It took the edge off anniversaries, quieted sudden waves of sorrow, made sleep possible again. Its presence was reassuring. It promised relief without confrontation. Yet grief that is softened rather than processed does not disappear. It settles. It reshapes itself. The drug that dulled sorrow also dulled memory's sharpness, flattening emotional landscapes until days blended together. This numbness was mistaken for recovery. Physicians observed improvement. Patients slept. Appetite returned. Outward function resumed. These signs were taken as evidence of healing. But the inner work of grief, the slow integration of loss, was interrupted. The mind learned that sorrow could be chemically deferred. Over time, this deferral altered expectations. Grief that resurfaced felt intrusive, even pathological. The bereaved, having tasted relief, found raw emotion intolerable. The return of pain felt like failure, not process. The response was predictable: another dose. In this way, opium reframed grief as a symptom to be managed, rather than an experience to be lived. The chemical solution arrived so swiftly that the question of meaning was never entertained. Why had this loss occurred? What had been altered? What needed to change? These inquiries were inconvenient. Relief required none of them. Victorian culture reinforced this approach. Silence was praised, endurance admired, emotional restraint equated with moral strength. Opium did not challenge these values, it supported them. It made stoicism achievable, even when the heart was breaking. But the cost was cumulative. Grief, unacknowledged, lingered beneath the surface. It returned as restlessness, melancholy, vague unease. These secondary symptoms were treated in the same way as the original sorrow with chemistry. What emerged was not healing, but maintenance. A society that believed it had conquered grief had merely anesthetized it. The sorrow remained. Only its voice had been lowered. There was no word for what was happening. Victorian medicine possessed a vast vocabulary for disease, deficiency, and decay, yet lacked the language to describe a body that required a remedy not to heal, but to feel normal. The condition unfolded quietly, without spectacle, without collapse. It did not resemble drunkenness or vice. It looked like routine. People did not crave opium in the way later generations would recognize. They reached for it because the absence felt wrong, because sleep would not come, because the nerves would not settle, because pain, once subdued, returned louder than before. These were interpreted not as signs of reliance, but as symptoms of the original ailment returning. The distinction mattered. If discomfort was seen as illness, the solution remained medical. If it was seen as consequence, everything would have to change. Physicians noted patterns but struggled to categorize them. Patients who had been treated successfully returned again and again. Dosages that once sufficed lost their effect. Relief shortened. Restlessness appeared when medicine was withheld. These observations accumulated slowly, dispersed across practices, rarely discussed in a unified way. There was no framework for concern. The prevailing belief was that substances prescribed with care could not corrupt. Excess was a moral failing, but moderation, especially when supervised, was assumed safe. Because opium was taken as directed, because it was legal, because it produced calm rather than chaos, it escaped suspicion. Dependence wore the mask of compliance. Those affected did not resist treatment. They followed instructions meticulously. They measured doses. They sought refills through proper channels. Their behavior reinforced trust rather than eroding it. Nothing about their conduct suggested loss of control. Yet the body told a different story. Tolerance crept in unnoticed. The nervous system adjusted its expectations, recalibrating around the presence of the drug. Relief became shorter-lived. The baseline shifted. What had once been exceptional became necessary. The absence of the substance was experienced not as neutrality, but as distress. This distress was misinterpreted. Physicians described it as nervousness, hysteria, weakness, recurrence. The proposed solution was always the same: continuation. Without a name, the phenomenon remained invisible. It could not be studied systematically. It could not be warned against explicitly. It could not be acknowledged publicly without undermining the authority of medicine itself. Even when concern surfaced, it was often redirected. Dependence was framed as an individual peculiarity rather than a structural outcome. Some bodies were deemed sensitive, some minds fragile. The drug itself remained blameless. Victorian society preferred explanations that preserved order. To admit that a widely used medicine could quietly reshape the body's needs would have required collective restraint. It would have meant accepting limits to progress. That admission did not align with the spirit of the age. Instead, reliance was normalized. The bottle on the mantel stayed. Prescriptions continued. Relief remained immediate, visible, reassuring. The absence of dramatic failure was taken as proof of safety. What no one fully grasped was how dependence could exist without collapse. It did not announce itself through excess or scandal. It embedded itself in daily life, in routine, in expectation. It altered the nervous system gradually enough to avoid detection. By the time discomfort appeared without the drug, the original reason for treatment had often faded from memory. Pain no longer corresponded to injury. Anxiety no longer matched circumstance. The body had learned a new equilibrium and demanded its maintenance. Still, there was no name. Without language, there could be no reckoning. Without reckoning, there could be no reform. And so the condition persisted, spreading quietly through households, clinics, and communities, mistaken for fragility rather than consequence. Victorian medicine did not fail to notice dependence. It failed to recognize it as something new, and in that absence of recognition, a pattern was set, one that future generations would inherit, refine, and repeat. What protected opium most effectively was not ignorance, but appearance. Victorian society was deeply invested in surfaces, manners, clothing, posture, speech. Respectability was not merely a social aspiration, it was a moral shield. Behaviors that aligned with it were presumed safe. Those that violated it were presumed dangerous. Opium, carefully positioned within the rituals of medicine and domestic life, benefited enormously from this distinction. The same substance that would later be condemned when used openly by the poor passed unnoticed when consumed quietly by the respectable, context-determined character. A bottle prescribed by a physician, measured in drops, administered indoors, carried none of the stigma attached to intoxication. It did not disrupt work. It did not invite disorder. It did not announce itself. Dependence, quietly housed within middle-class parlors and hospital wards, did not resemble vice. It resembled routine. This camouflage extended into language. Laudanum was spoken of as a tonic, a sedative, a restorative. These words framed its use as corrective rather than indulgent. A person taking opium was not escaping reality, they were managing it responsibly. The narrative protected both patient and practitioner from scrutiny. Respectability also dictated who was believed. When laborers collapsed or the poor displayed erratic behavior, substances were blamed. When educated men and women reported vague, nervous complaints, substances were prescribed. The same chemical moved between worlds, acquiring entirely different meanings depending on who touched it and how. This division allowed dependence to flourish unchecked among those least likely to be questioned. Middle and upper-class users were assumed capable of moderation. Their restraint was taken for granted. Any distress they experienced was interpreted as fragility, sensitivity, or moral strain, not chemical consequence. The home, with its curtains drawn and routines intact, hid what the street would have exposed. A mother who relied on laudanum remained attentive, composed, presentable. A professional who used opium slept better, worked steadily, spoke calmly. These outcomes reinforced the belief that the drug enhanced function rather than undermined it. Medicine itself adopted this perspective. Physicians were trained to look for visible signs of harm, disruption, collapse, chaos. Opium produced none of these immediately. Its damage, when it came, was subtle. Emotional flattening, diminished resilience, quiet compulsion. These were easily attributed to temperament or circumstance. Even when dependency deepened, respectability provided cover. Patients followed instructions. They sought prescriptions through proper channels. They did not steal or deceive. Their behavior confirmed the belief that control remained intact. This illusion of control was powerful. It allowed society to maintain a comforting narrative that danger belonged elsewhere, to the margins, to the unruly, to those without education or refinement. Chemistry, when paired with respectability, was presumed safe. The result was a dangerous blind spot. Dependence that looked like order escaped intervention. The same mechanisms that protected reputations delayed recognition of harm. And because the harm did not announce itself dramatically, it was tolerated. Over time, respectability became not just camouflage, but justification. If a substance allowed people to maintain their roles to mother, to labor, to endure, it was deemed beneficial. The cost to the individual nervous system was considered secondary, if it was considered at all. This logic embedded itself deeply. It taught society to judge drugs not by their effects, but by who used them and how quietly. It established a pattern that would recur with new substances, new classes, new crises. The lesson was simple and enduring. If a chemical preserved appearances, it could not be truly dangerous. And so opium continued its work behind closed doors, sheltered by manners, authority, and the comforting belief that harm always looks unruly. It did not. It often looked respectable. Normalization did not arrive as acceptance, it arrived as habit. By the late Victorian period, opium no longer felt like an intervention. It felt like infrastructure, part of the quiet machinery that kept daily life moving without disruption. Its presence required no explanation. Its use required no justification. Relief had been folded so thoroughly into routine that its absence felt abnormal. This was the moment when danger became invisible. The first normalization occurred not in policy or proclamation, but in expectation. Pain was no longer something to be negotiated or endured, it was something presumed solvable. Sleeplessness was no longer tolerated as circumstance. Anxiety was no longer interpreted as signal. Each discomfort carried an unspoken assumption. There must be a remedy, and it must work quickly. Opium fulfilled this expectation with unnerving reliability. The language surrounding it grew casual. Physicians spoke of it as one might speak of warmth or nourishment, something beneficial when applied correctly. Households discussed it without hesitation. Dosage instructions were shared matter-of-factly. Its use crossed thresholds of age and condition without alarm. What had once been a potent substance became an everyday solution. This shift mattered profoundly. When a remedy becomes ordinary, scrutiny fades. Extraordinary tools invite caution. Ordinary ones invite reliance. The medical establishment did not mark this transition consciously. There was no moment when opium was declared harmless. Instead, its safety was inferred from familiarity. If a substance had been used for years without visible catastrophe, it was assumed trustworthy. The absence of immediate disaster was mistaken for proof. But normalization also reshaped how symptoms were interpreted. Discomfort that persisted despite treatment was seen not as consequence, but as escalation. The solution was not withdrawal, but adjustment. More frequent dosing, slightly stronger preparation, a refined compound. Thus, normalization paved the way for intensification. Patients, having learned that relief was both available and expected, became less tolerant of sensation. The threshold for discomfort lowered. What had once been manageable now felt intrusive. This sensitivity was not recognized as adaptation, it was perceived as fragility. The body was blamed for failing to respond permanently to treatment. Physicians, under pressure to deliver results, complied. Their success was measured in quiet rooms and functional patients, not long-term resilience. A treatment that restored immediate order was preferable to one that required patience or explanation. Normalization also altered moral judgment. To rely on opium was no longer a failing, it was prudent, a responsible response to strain, a sign of engagement with modern medicine, rather than stubborn adherence to outdated endurance. The narrative inverted itself. Refusing relief could be seen as neglectful. In this way, dependence embedded itself within virtue. No alarms were raised because nothing appeared broken. Households functioned, work continued, grief was contained, pain was muted. The visible metrics of social stability remained intact. The costs, tolerance, quiet compulsion, emotional flattening were too diffuse to register as crisis. What was lost in this normalization was not merely caution, but curiosity. The question of why suffering was so widespread ceased to matter. If pain could be managed, its origins were irrelevant. Industrial strain, social isolation, relentless expectations all were rendered tolerable through chemistry. This pattern would echo repeatedly. Each new substance would be introduced as solution. Each would be normalized through routine use. Each would quietly reshape the nervous system of those who relied upon it. And each time, the absence of immediate catastrophe would be mistaken for control. The first normalization taught society a dangerous lesson, that relief, once made ordinary, need not be examined. By the time anyone thought to ask what had changed, the answer was already embedded in daily life. Pain had not disappeared. It had simply been scheduled around. When morphine arrived, it did so wearing the language of improvement. It was introduced not as a replacement for opium's failures, but as its refinement, purified, measured, reliable. Where laudanum had been imprecise, mixed, diluted, variable morphine promised control. It represented chemistry disciplined by science, pain reduced to dosage, suffering brought under institutional authority. Hospitals welcomed it. The Victorian ward was a place of extremes: blood, noise, overcrowding, and endurance pressed into tight quarters. Surgery advanced faster than anesthesia. Operations were quicker, but recovery was brutal. Pain was unavoidable and increasingly unacceptable. Morphine offered something laudanum could not: certainty. Here was pain relief that could be quantified. Physicians spoke of it with reverence. This was not a household remedy or a domestic comfort. It was a medical instrument, administered by professionals, calculated, recorded. Its effects were swift and unmistakable. Patients quieted, muscles relaxed. The chaos of the ward softened. Morphine did not merely relieve pain, it transformed the environment. A calmer ward was a more efficient ward. Procedures proceeded without interruption. Patients rested. Staff moved more easily between beds. The success of the drug was measured not in long-term outcome, but in immediate order. And order, once again, was mistaken for health. Unlike opium, morphine carried the authority of isolation. Its chemical purity suggested safety. If a substance could be extracted, standardized, and named, it felt mastered. The messy uncertainties of plant-based medicine were replaced by crystalline certainty. Science had separated the useful from the dangerous, or so it was believed. This belief mattered. Morphine's institutional setting shielded it from moral scrutiny. A drug administered in a hospital could not be indulgent. It could not be vice. It was treatment. Its power was reframed as professionalism rather than potency. Patients trusted it instinctively. Pain that vanished so completely felt miraculous. Relief arrived without effort, without negotiation. For those who had endured unfiltered agony, the contrast was overwhelming. Morphine did not dull pain, it erased it. And erasure recalibrates expectation. The body learned quickly. The absence of pain became the new standard. Sensation, when it returned, felt intolerable by comparison. Physicians responded as they had been trained to restore equilibrium. Another dose, slightly higher, still measured, still justified. The ward became a place where dependency could form under supervision and remain unnoticed. Patients were discharged, improved, quieter, grateful. Any lingering need for relief was attributed to injury, not adaptation. If morphine had been required once, it could be required again. War would soon accelerate this process. But even in peacetime wards, the pattern was set. Morphine taught medicine a powerful lesson, that pain could be silenced completely, and that silence was success. What no one yet reckoned with was, what happens when a nervous system learns that silence is possible? The hospital environment masked early signs of dependence. Withdrawal looked like pain returning. Restlessness looked like unresolved injury. The language of medicine absorbed these symptoms seamlessly, translating consequence into diagnosis. Morphine did not challenge medical authority, it reinforced it. Each successful administration strengthened the belief that chemistry, when controlled by professionals, could not betray its purpose. In truth, the betrayal was subtle. By bringing pain relief into the ward, morphine shifted responsibility away from context and onto chemistry. The body's experience was no longer interrogated, it was overridden. Recovery was judged by calm, not resilience. And in that quiet ward beneath clean sheets and careful charts, the next phase of inheritance took shape, one where relief was no longer domestic or optional, but clinical, expected, and absolute. Morphine had entered medicine not as a warning, but as a triumph. And triumphs are rarely questioned while they are still working. The syringe transformed relief into certainty. Where tinctures had relied on patience and pills depended on digestion, the needle offered immediacy, a direct route, no delay, no dilution, no ambiguity. Morphine delivered by injection did not negotiate with the body, it announced itself. Pain retreated at once. Sensation fell away. Control was absolute. Victorian medicine embraced this efficiency with quiet awe. The syringe represented mastery made visible. Glass, metal, precision. Each component reflected the century's confidence in intervention. To pierce the skin was not seen as invasive, but corrective. The body was opened briefly, so that order could be restored. Pain, once a complex signal, became a target. Injection reframed the relationship between patient and physician. Relief was no longer something the patient managed at home. It was administered, controlled, observed. The doctor's hand delivered calm directly into the bloodstream, bypassing the messiness of digestion and delay. This intimacy strengthened authority. The patient submitted not just to treatment, but to expertise itself. The effects were dramatic. Patients who had cried out fell silent. Muscles loosened. Breath deepened. The transformation felt miraculous. Witnessing it reinforced belief not just in morphine, but in the method. The needle worked. And because it worked so completely, it redefined expectation. Once pain could be erased instantly, tolerance for its presence diminished. Patients began to fear sensation itself. Physicians, seeing how swiftly relief could be delivered, grew less willing to allow discomfort to persist. Why endure what could be eliminated? Why wait when certainty was available? Injection accelerated everything. Tolerance formed faster. Dependence, when it came, arrived more sharply. The body adapted to the sudden flood of relief, recalibrating its baseline around the experience. When the drug wore off, the contrast was stark. Pain returned with urgency, stripped of context, amplified by comparison. These reactions were not recognized as adaptation. They were interpreted as severity. The injury must be worse than thought. The nerves more damaged, the illness more entrenched. The response was logical within the framework of progress. Repeat the intervention. The syringe did not appear dangerous. It appeared modern. Its very design suggested control. Measurements were exact. Dosages were calculated. The idea that such precision could produce unintended consequence seemed contradictory. If harm existed, it was assumed to arise from misuse, not method. But the method mattered. Injection bypassed the body's natural filters and pacing. It overwhelmed receptors accustomed to gradual change. The nervous system learned a new language, one spoken fluently and forcefully. Relief became something delivered, not achieved. Calm was no longer a state the body reached. It was imposed. Hospitals recorded success in immediate terms. Pain scores dropped. Recovery appeared smoother. The quiet ward returned. No one measured what happened after discharge, how the memory of relief lingered, how sensation felt intolerable without it, how the body sought what it had been taught to expect. The needle's authority extended beyond medicine. It symbolized progress itself, direct, decisive, unhesitating. To question it would have been to question the trajectory of science. And science, in that era, was not easily challenged. Thus, injection became standard. The needle moved from novelty to necessity, from intervention to expectation. Each use reinforced the belief that chemistry, delivered precisely, could only improve outcomes. What was not considered was how quickly the body learns. Once relief arrives without delay, patience disappears. Once pain is erased instantly, endurance feels cruel. Once control is centralized in the syringe, autonomy quietly recedes. The needle promised progress. What it delivered was acceleration of relief, of dependence, of a pattern that would prove difficult to slow. War stripped medicine of patience. On the battlefield, there was no room for deliberation, no appetite for nuance. Bodies arrived broken in numbers too large for contemplation, limbs shattered, flesh torn. Shock set in before names were recorded. Pain was not an experience to be interpreted, it was an obstacle to be cleared. Morphine became indispensable. The syringe followed the army as faithfully as the rifle. It traveled in satchels, was issued with authority, administered with urgency. A wounded soldier who could be calmed could be moved. A quiet body could be triaged. A compliant patient allowed the machinery of war to continue. Relief was not offered for comfort alone. It was strategic. Pain, left untreated, disrupted logistics. It delayed transport, complicated surgery, fractured morale. Morphine erased these problems efficiently. A dose steadied breath, slowed panic, made the unbearable bearable long enough for the next step. The drug did not ask permission. It imposed order. For soldiers, this experience was formative. The body learned obedience under chemical command. Sensation disappeared on cue. Fear softened. Pain receded. In moments of extreme vulnerability, relief arrived not through endurance or adaptation, but through intervention. The nervous system took note. War taught the body a new lesson, that surrender to chemistry was survival. Physicians, overwhelmed by scale, relied on what worked fastest. There was little concern for future consequence when the present demanded action. A soldier alive and calm was success. What followed weeks later, months later, was beyond the battlefield's horizon. This was not negligence. It was necessity. Yet necessity leaves residue. Repeated exposure to morphine under extreme stress accelerated adaptation. The body, primed by trauma, accepted chemical relief readily. Tolerance grew swiftly. The contrast between agony and sudden calm etched itself deeply into memory. Relief was no longer abstract, it was visceral, immediate, unforgettable. When the war ended, bodies returned home, altered. Many soldiers carried injuries that lingered. Others carried something less visible, a nervous system trained to expect chemical intervention. Pain, once associated with morphine's disappearance, felt intolerable without it. Restlessness followed absence, sleep fractured, anxiety surged. These symptoms were interpreted as after effects of war, shell shock, nerves, lingering wounds. The language of trauma had not yet matured. The response, predictably, was continuation. The medicine that had served so well in war was trusted in peace. Morphine followed soldiers home. Doctors, honoring service and sacrifice, were reluctant to withhold relief. A man who had endured the battlefield deserved comfort. Prescriptions were written with sympathy, not suspicion. The boundary between treatment and reliance dissolved quietly, framed as compassion. War also transformed medicine's self-image. The success of morphine in combat reinforced faith in chemical control. If pain could be conquered under fire, it could be managed anywhere. The battlefield became proof of concept. Extreme conditions validated extreme solutions. What was not validated was the long-term cost. The body, having learned obedience through chemistry, resisted its absence. Pain returned sharper. Calm felt unreachable without intervention. This dependence did not resemble indulgence. It resembled survival continuing by other means. Society honored veterans while failing to recognize what had been altered within them. The same authority that had ordered obedience in war now prescribed relief in peace. The pattern continued, uninterrupted. War had taught medicine efficiency. It had taught bodies compliance. and it had taught society that chemical relief, once justified by necessity, need not ever be relinquished. The battlefield was left behind. The lesson remained. The war ended, but the body did not forget. Men returned carrying what could be seen: bandages, scars, stiffened limbs, and what could not. Their nerves had been rewritten by urgency, by injury, by chemistry delivered at moments when pain was absolute and relief immediate. Home expected restoration. The body delivered something else. In civilian rooms, pain behaved differently. It was slower, quieter, less dramatic than the agony of the field, but more persistent. Old wounds ached with weather. Sleep fractured without warning. Sudden noise tightened muscles before thought intervened. The calm once provided by morphine in moments of crisis was now absent, and its absence was keenly felt. Doctors listened. They examined scars, noted tremors, heard complaints that lacked clear cause. The language of trauma was still crude. What could not be located in bone or tissue was attributed to nerves. Exhaustion, after effects. The war had taken its toll. Relief was warranted. Morphine, familiar and trusted, remained the answer. Prescriptions were written with sympathy. These were not idle men seeking escape. They were veterans disciplined, proven, deserving. To deny them relief would have seemed ungrateful, even cruel. The medicine that had steadied them under fire was allowed to steady them in peace. But peace demanded different endurance. Without the structure of battle, the drug's role shifted. No longer a temporary intervention, it became a companion, a way to manage lingering pain, restless nights, sudden agitation. Each dose restored a memory of calm the body had learned to expect. Each omission made that calm feel further away. The soldier's relationship to sensation had changed. Pain, once followed immediately by chemical relief, now felt intolerable without it. The contrast was the injury. The body had learned that suffering could be erased and resented its return. Dependence grew not from indulgence, but from comparison. Society misunderstood this transformation. A veteran who struggled was seen as weakened by war, not altered by treatment. His need for relief was framed as consequence of service, not adaptation of the nervous system. The distinction mattered. One invited compassion, the other would have invited caution. Physicians continued treatment because it appeared humane. The alternative, allowing pain to persist, felt like neglect. And so relief continued, carefully measured, responsibly administered, outwardly controlled. Yet control was increasingly illusory. The body adjusted, tolerance increased, relief shortened. The same dose no longer sufficed. Requests for continuation were made politely, through proper channels, supported by visible injury or credible history. Nothing about the behavior suggested moral failing. It suggested necessity. Families noticed changes they could not name, a flattening of affect, a distance that lingered even in quiet moments, irritability when doses were delayed. These were attributed to the war itself. The drug remained blameless. This pattern extended beyond individual households. Clinics saw growing numbers of veterans returning for refills. Hospitals treated complications without tracing their origin. The system absorbed the outcome without acknowledging the cause. The soldier had come home, but not unchanged. His body had learned a lesson under extraordinary circumstances, that chemistry could command pain, regulate fear, impose calm. Civilian life offered no alternative framework strong enough to replace that lesson. Conversation could not compete. Rest could not replicate immediacy. Time could not erase memory etched into nerve. Morphine remained, and with it, the quiet inheritance of a war that did not end when the guns fell silent. The battlefield had receded, but its chemistry lingered in bodies expected to resume ordinary life. The soldier returned to peace. The nervous system did not. It waited for the relief it had been taught to obey. By the time questions began to surface, authority had already set. Victorian medicine had grown accustomed to being trusted not tentatively, but completely. The successes of chemistry, surgery, and sanitation had elevated the physician from healer to arbiter. His judgments carried weight not only in the clinic, but in the home, the factory, the battlefield, and the courtroom of public opinion. To doubt him was to doubt progress itself. Morphine's place within this hierarchy was secure. It was prescribed, measured, administered, and recorded. Its effects were predictable, its outcomes immediate. In a system that valued visible results, this reliability was invaluable. A quiet patient confirmed competence. A calm ward affirmed control. Each successful intervention reinforced the authority that delivered it. Over time, this authority became less flexible. Early hesitations, questions about tolerance, dependence, lingering need, were gradually absorbed into routine. When patterns repeat without crisis, they cease to feel alarming. Physicians encountered returning patients with familiar complaints and familiar solutions. The act of prescribing became reflexive, supported by habit and expectation. Medical authority did not fail to notice the persistence of symptoms. It reinterpreted them. If pain returned, the injury was assumed unresolved. If agitation appeared, nerves were blamed. If relief shortened, dosage was adjusted. The framework remained intact. Chemistry was not questioned. The body was. This asymmetry mattered. It positioned medicine as infallible by definition. Any negative outcome could be attributed to patient constitution, circumstance, or compliance, but never to the treatment itself. Such a stance protected professional confidence but narrowed perception. Institutions reinforced this rigidity. Hospitals standardized protocols. Military medicine codified dosage. Medical journals favored efficacy over caution. Dissenting voices, when they appeared, were isolated and softened by consensus. A single physician's concern could not compete with widespread success. Authority hardened through repetition. Young doctors were trained within this environment. They learned to value decisiveness, to act rather than hesitate, to relieve rather than observe. Morphine fit this ethic perfectly. It offered clarity in moments of uncertainty. It allowed medicine to appear decisive even when understanding was incomplete. Patients internalized this authority as well. They deferred interpretation of their own bodies. If pain persisted, it was because something was wrong, not because treatment had altered sensation. Trust flowed one direction. The physician interpreted. The patient complied. This compliance reinforced the system. No one demanded explanations for long-term use, because the authority prescribing it appeared absolute. No one insisted on alternatives because the available solution worked, at least in the moment. And no one wanted to risk appearing ungrateful, difficult, or backward by questioning relief. Medical authority also carried moral weight. A doctor who withheld pain relief risked appearing callous. Compassion became synonymous with prescription. To deny morphine felt like denying care itself. This emotional framing made restraint difficult, even when doubts arose. Over time, the line between treatment and maintenance blurred completely. Patients were not cured, they were managed. Symptoms were not resolved, they were suppressed. The goal shifted subtly from restoring health to preserving function. Authority adapted accordingly. What hardened was not cruelty, but certainty. Medicine grew confident in its ability to manage suffering chemically. The absence of immediate catastrophe was taken as validation. The quiet accumulation of dependency went unmeasured, unchallenged. By the time new substances appeared stronger, more refined, more potent, they entered a system already predisposed to trust them. The philosophical groundwork had been laid. Chemistry, when delivered by authority, was assumed safe. And so authority did not merely permit dependence. It normalized it. It structured it. It made it respectable. By the end of this phase, medicine no longer asked whether relief should be given. It asked only how quickly. The question of consequence had been quietly retired, not through negligence, but through confidence that had learned not to doubt itself. Dosage gave the appearance of control. Numbers reassured where uncertainty lingered. Milligrams replaced instinct. Charts replaced judgment. A precise amount, carefully calculated, suggested mastery over what had once been unpredictable. If the dose was correct, the outcome was assumed safe. This belief settled deeply into Victorian medicine, quietly reshaping its relationship with risk. Morphine lent itself perfectly to this illusion. Unlike laudanum, whose strength varied and whose effects unfolded slowly, morphine could be measured exactly. A physician could point to the quantity administered and feel absolved of uncertainty. Harm, if it occurred, could be attributed to excess. Safety, therefore, was defined by moderation, not by duration. This distinction proved fatal. The body does not experience dosage as static. It adapts. It remembers. A quantity that once subdued pain begins, over time, to merely postpone it. Relief shortens. The interval between doses tightens, yet the numbers on the chart remain unchanged, lending false reassurance. The illusion persists. If the amount is the same, the treatment must still be appropriate. Physicians trusted the arithmetic more than the organism. When patients reported diminishing relief, the response was logical within this framework. The pain must be worsening, the injury more severe, the nerves more compromised. The solution was adjustment, incremental, justified, documented. A slightly higher dose, a more frequent interval, still within bounds, still measured. What was never recalculated was the body itself. Tolerance was not understood as a transformation, but as resistance. The body appeared uncooperative, even defective. Chemistry was presumed constant. The variable was flesh. This assumption absolved the treatment of responsibility while quietly binding the patient more tightly to it. Dosage also reassured institutions. Hospitals relied on numbers to standardize care. Military medicine used dosage to maintain order under pressure. Journals published tables and guidelines that framed safety as adherence rather than outcome. The more precise the instruction, the more confident the system became. Yet precision masked accumulation. A dose administered once is not the same as a dose administered daily. Relief repeated becomes conditioning. The nervous system adjusts its baseline, recalibrating what feels normal. This adaptation was invisible to charts. It unfolded internally, beneath the thresholds of measurement. Patients sensed the change before physicians did. They noticed that calm no longer lasted. That pain returned sharper. That unease crept in sooner. But these sensations were translated into clinical language that favored escalation rather than reflection. The dosage illusion also shaped patient behavior. Those who followed instructions meticulously believed themselves safe. They trusted the numbers as much as the authority that prescribed them. If discomfort returned, it could not be because the medicine was harmful, it must be because the condition persisted. This belief discouraged self-awareness. The body's signals were overridden by arithmetic. Sensation was no longer evidence. Numbers were. The illusion hardened over time. It became doctrine. Safety was defined not by outcome, but by compliance with protocol. A treatment could be repeated indefinitely, so long as it adhered to established limits. Duration was irrelevant. Context was secondary. The dose was king. This framework would endure far beyond the Victorian era. It would be inherited by modern medicine, refined with technology, reinforced by policy. The belief that numbers confer safety would survive every warning sign, every pattern of dependence, every quiet collapse. In the Victorian ward, however, the illusion was still young and unchallenged. Morphine was administered with confidence. Dosage charts were followed faithfully. Patients grew quieter. Dependence deepened invisibly. The math was correct. The conclusion was not. By trusting dosage as proof of safety, medicine taught itself a dangerous lesson, that control could be quantified without understanding. And once learned, that lesson would prove remarkably difficult to unlearn. The nervous woman became a diagnosis before she became a person. Victorian medicine spoke fluently about nerves, but poorly about lives. Female distress, fatigue, agitation, sadness, irritability was gathered into a single, convenient category. The problem was not circumstance, it was constitution. Women were described as delicate, sensitive, easily overstimulated. Their suffering was framed as intrinsic rather than responsive. Sedation offered correction. Morphine and its relatives were prescribed not to heal, but to quiet. A woman whose nerves interfered with domestic order was not interrogated about her conditions. Long hours, repeated pregnancies, isolation, grief, but treated for imbalance. The solution did not require social change, it required compliance. This approach felt humane within the logic of the time. Sedation softened distress without challenging expectations. A calm woman was a functional woman. A functional woman upheld the household. Chemistry preserved the architecture of society without disturbing its load-bearing assumptions. Physicians described these prescriptions as gentle, restorative, necessary. The language mattered. It implied care rather than control. A woman who received morphine was not being silenced, she was being soothed. Her agitation was not protest, it was pathology. What was never asked was why agitation was so common. Female bodies were subjected to continuous demand. Pregnancy followed pregnancy. Recovery was brief. Emotional labor was constant and invisible. Grief was frequent and private. Autonomy was limited. Within this context, distress was inevitable. Sedation made it manageable. The nervous system learned accordingly. Relief arrived swiftly, predictably. Anxiety softened. Thoughts slowed. The edge dulled. For many women, this felt like the first true rest they had known in years. The drug did not grant freedom, but it granted pause. That pause became necessary. Dependence did not announce itself loudly. It emerged as routine, a dose in the afternoon to steady the nerves, another at night to allow sleep, always measured, always justified, always framed as care. Tolerance crept in quietly, relief shortened, irritability returned sooner. Physicians responded by adjusting treatment, never questioning the framework. The woman's condition was assumed chronic. Her nerves were inherently unstable. Ongoing sedation felt appropriate. This logic erased context. A woman who resisted sedation risked appearing hysterical or ungrateful. One who accepted it was praised for composure. The reward structure was clear. Calm equaled virtue. Chemistry delivered calm. Over time, emotional range narrowed. Joy flattened. Sorrow blurred. The woman remained present, attentive, manageable. These outcomes were celebrated as success. The cost to identity, resilience, autonomy went unmeasured. Medical authority reinforced the pattern. Journals discussed nervous disorders extensively, offering dosage guidance rather than social inquiry. Sedation became standardized care. Female distress was managed chemically, not examined. This approach would echo forward through generations. Women would continue to be prescribed solutions for symptoms whose causes lay beyond the body. Sedation would be offered where agency was denied. Chemistry would substitute for reform. In Victorian wards and parlors, the nervous woman became both patient and proof evidence that medicine could restore order without changing conditions. The system worked, so long as quiet was the goal. The lesson was absorbed deeply. When distress challenges expectations, sedation is preferable to listening. And once that lesson was learned, it did not remain confined to one gender or one century. Hospitals, once centers of care and observation, learned a new language, the language of quiet. Victorian wards were noisy by necessity. Screams, coughs, the scrape of boots, the clatter of instruments all marked the rhythm of life and death. Yet, amid this cacophony, the modern physician sought control, order, and predictability. Pain could not be allowed to interfere with treatment, nor could distress overwhelm the fragile social contract of the ward. Silence became a measure of success. Opium and morphine facilitated this transformation. Patients sedated into calm ceased to cry, to thrash, to interrupt. Their suffering, once public and disordered, was rendered private, contained within the body and masked by chemical control. A quiet ward was easier to manage. Staff moved efficiently between beds. Procedures proceeded without interruption. The very appearance of order became a sign of competence. Physicians quickly learned to rely upon this silence. It was not cruelty, it was efficiency. A patient under sedation did not distract others. He did not exhaust nurses. He did not disrupt schedules. The absence of noise became an indicator that treatment was proceeding as intended. Relief and control were inseparable. The quieter the patient, the more successful the intervention appeared. This quiet extended beyond the audible. Emotional expression diminished under sedation. Anxiety, grief, fear, all were softened, often before they could be acknowledged or addressed. Patients learned that outward complaint was neither necessary nor productive. The body's protest was smoothed chemically, leaving only the surface calm that physicians, nurses, and visitors could observe. Silence became institutionalized. Wards adopted routines structured around the predictable effects of morphine. Dosing schedules regulated activity. Observation focused on compliance rather than sensation. Staff judged outcomes by what they could see: posture, breathing, color, internal experience, restlessness, craving. Agitation remained largely invisible. Hospitals measured what could be measured, not what should have been considered. The logic reinforced itself. Quiet patients were celebrated. Compliant patients were praised. Pain, when absent, was taken as evidence of healing. Dependence, when gradual and orderly, was unnoticed. Relief, immediate and observable, reinforced faith in chemical control. Each success encouraged further reliance on sedation, accelerating a cycle whose consequences would remain hidden. Even when complications arose, they were reframed. Tolerance, withdrawal, or emotional flattening were interpreted as illness, weakness, or misadventure. The medicine was presumed correct. The body, or circumstance, was deemed at fault. Thus, hospitals reinforced not only treatment, but also the authority of medicine to intervene without challenge. This cultivation of silence had consequences beyond the ward. Patients internalized the lesson. Pain that had once commanded attention was no longer acknowledged. Discomfort became something to endure chemically rather than to express. Voices that might have demanded explanation or empathy were stilled. The body adapted to expect intervention before experience. In this way, hospitals became laboratories of compliance. Order replaced inquiry, efficiency replaced understanding, calm replaced experience. The very purpose of medicine, care, observation, guidance was redirected toward maintaining the appearance of control. By the close of the Victorian era, wards had learned what the home had already discovered, that silence could be produced, measured, and relied upon. What was once a symptom, a call for attention, a signal, had been transformed into a metric, and metrics in the Victorian mind equaled success. Patients rested, beds remained tidy, procedures continued, and the quiet that prevailed masked a cost few yet recognized: the slow erosion of the body's autonomy, the recalibration of nerves, and the first seeds of dependence that would echo long after the gaslights had dimmed. The language of medicine like the glass of the apothecary bottle, was carefully polished to hide what it contained. Dependence existed long before the word had found its place in dictionaries or journals, but in Victorian discourse it was neither named nor condemned. Instead, it was quietly reclassified, absorbed into the taxonomy of nerves, temperament, and constitution. A patient who returned repeatedly for laudanum or morphine was seldom accused of indulgence. The assumption was that the body itself demanded correction. Weakness, sensitivity, hysteria, these labels softened the moral weight of chemical reliance. If a man or woman could not sleep without a dose, it was not the substance's fault. It was their nerves, their temperament, their fragility. The drug, precise and measured, remained above reproach. This reclassification served both medicine and society. By framing chemical reliance as natural, inevitable, or even laudable, physicians avoided confrontation with a truth they were ill-equipped to manage: that regular administration could create need independent of original illness. Patients, reassured that their habits were not shameful, complied willingly, reinforcing the illusion. Dependence existed, but it did so under a cloak of legitimacy. Hospitals codified this approach. Patients described as nervous, irritable, or fatigued were treated systematically. Charts recorded doses, timing, and observed calm. Complaints that persisted were translated into symptoms requiring more of the same solution. The repetition of prescription reinforced authority. The body adapted, but the language surrounding it suggested the patient was still healthy, or at least appropriately fragile. Home and clinic became inseparable in this regard. Families understood that a quiet, compliant relative reflected both propriety and medical wisdom. Nerves softened by morphine or laudanum were evidence of care, not complication. The household learned that chemical relief was an extension of morality, orderly, invisible, and sanctioned by professionals. Tolerance, though understood empirically by some, was seldom interpreted as a problem. If the first dose failed, it was because the condition had intensified or the patient was unusually sensitive. More was prescribed, always within the veneer of moderation, always justified by observation. Chemical reliance was normalized not by recklessness, but by authority. Even the subtle psychological effects of prolonged use were recast. Emotional flattening, restlessness, irritability. When doses were delayed, all were described in terms of the patient's constitution rather than the compound. Medicine absorbed consequence into its framework, converting risk into symptom, dependency into diagnosis. The drug itself remained impeccable. This reclassification also shaped social understanding. Dependence, when it appeared in the working classes or among the visibly impoverished, was moralized. Theft, deception, or vice were attached to usage. Among the respectable, however, the same behavior was interpreted as necessity or vulnerability. The distinction was subtle, but it allowed chemical reliance to flourish invisibly, quietly reinforced by both professional and social structures. Thus, dependence became less a problem to be solved than a condition to be managed. It was naturalized, softened, rendered compatible with daily life. The body, conditioned by repeated relief, came to expect it as ordinary. The patient, reassured by the careful framing, continued without questioning. Victorian medicine had not abolished danger, it had merely renamed it. By reclassifying dependence, the culture preserved appearances, maintained authority, and deferred the reckoning to a future yet unimagined. What began as relief had become expectation. What was once extraordinary had become routine, and the cost, invisible beneath propriety, would echo far beyond the gaslit ward. Even the quietest systems eventually register disturbance. By the late Victorian period, the widespread reliance on opium and its derivatives had produced a society remarkably efficient at masking distress. Children slept, mothers endured, soldiers returned calm, factories functioned, and wards remained orderly. The surface shimmered with the appearance of control. Yet beneath this veneer, subtle tremors began to emerge, signals that the body was negotiating with chemistry rather than yielding willingly. The first quiet alarm did not announce itself with spectacle. It did not arrive in riots, scandals, or dramatic collapse. It arrived in whispers. A patient who required a slightly larger dose than yesterday. A young mother whose hands shook despite measured laudanum. A laborer whose complaints of pain were softer but more frequent. These instances were initially small, isolated, and easily rationalized. Doctors interpreted them as variation in constitution, illness progressing, nerves unusually sensitive. The drug itself remained beyond suspicion. But patterns persisted. Physicians began to notice that some patients returned more often than expected. Ward nurses observed subtle changes in behavior, restlessness between doses, agitation when relief was delayed, faint unease that would not dissipate. At first, these observations were considered incidental, the normal unpredictability of human biology, yet repetition could not be ignored. The body was signaling that relief had become necessary, not merely desirable. These quiet alarms were rarely understood as dependence. The term did not yet exist. Medical language lacked a framework to interpret them accurately. Instead, the observations were folded into existing categories: nervous disorder, sensitivity, weak constitution. The symptom, not the cause, was treated. And thus, the cycle continued unbroken. The patient received more drops, more attention, and more reassurance, all under the guise of proper care. Society itself reinforced the misinterpretation. Families celebrated calm children and compliant mothers. Factories praised continued productivity. Military wards recorded soldiers functioning despite trauma. The markers of success were visible. The subtler signs of growing reliance, how quickly calm returned to baseline, how agitation sharpened in the absence of medication remained invisible, dismissed, or misunderstood. Even among physicians who recognized a pattern, action was limited. Caution conflicted with prevailing authority. Prescribing relief had become both habit and moral imperative. To hesitate was to risk criticism, to withhold aid, to appear indifferent. The system had no language for measured concern. Relief was always justified. What it produced quietly was rarely questioned. This first quiet alarm was not an isolated incident. It was the herald of a new reality. It indicated that bodies had been conditioned to expect chemical intervention as normal. It suggested that the very definition of health had shifted from natural resilience to managed stability. Pain, once a messenger, had been taught to defer to the syringe, the bottle, and the prescription pad. And yet, because the alarm was quiet, society continued to proceed as if nothing had changed. Efficiency, order, and propriety were maintained. Children slept. Mothers remained composed. Factories hummed. Wards were silent. The superficial measures of success masked the deeper adaptation taking hold beneath the skin. In this way, the first quiet alarm passed largely unnoticed. Its signal, subtle, insidious, and easily rationalized, was absorbed into routine. But the lesson it carried was profound. Chemical relief could create its own demand, and the body, trained to expect it, would eventually insist. The era of unquestioned calm was nearing its limits. The body had begun to speak back, and in the silence, that voice was already urgent. It arrived with a promise of refinement. By the closing years of the Victorian age, chemists had distilled and purified morphine into a new compound, heroin. It was introduced under the guise of progress. More potent, more predictable, more controllable. The language surrounding it was deliberate. Heroin was gentle. Heroin was safe. It soothed the cough, quieted the nerves, and restored calm without the harshness associated with previous remedies. The very name suggested virtue. an innovation meant to improve upon nature's unpredictability. Heroin entered society quietly, yet its arrival was immediate in effect. Physicians embraced it as a superior alternative to laudanum and morphine. Patients responded with relief so swift it seemed almost miraculous. Pain, once persistent, retreated. Sleepless nights were shortened. Agitation dissolved. The nervous system, trained by decades of prior chemical intervention, accepted the new compound with obedience. Where morphine had been reliable, heroin was instantaneous. The framing of heroin was meticulous. Advertisements, medical journals, and apothecary recommendations emphasized refinement and care. It was not a drug of excess. It was a solution to imperfections in older compounds. Doctors, eager to demonstrate both skill and modernity, prescribed it liberally, confident in its chemical purity and measurable dosage. Families welcomed it with relief. A quiet child, a composed mother, a soothed patient was proof of efficacy. Yet the very qualities that made heroin so attractive also concealed its danger. Its potency outstripped the body's prior expectations. The nervous system, accustomed to morphine's modulation, experienced the new compound as more complete, more absolute. Relief came faster, more thoroughly, but its absence was correspondingly sharper. The body learned to expect this total calm. Withdrawal, when it inevitably arrived, was pronounced, though initially invisible beneath the facade of controlled administration. Heroin's introduction also reinforced existing social hierarchies of medicine. Those who consumed it within the bounds of respectability, children, middle-class women, military veterans, were assumed to be safe, compliant, and morally sound. Its use was framed as care, not indulgence. It was medicine, not vice. Even as dependence began to form, the veneer of propriety obscured its emergence. Physicians, emboldened by chemical certainty, extended its application widely. Nervous women, weary mothers, agitated patients all received the new remedy. Its effects were predictable enough to satisfy institutional standards. Wards grew quieter. Households functioned more smoothly. The appearance of order reassured everyone involved, masking the subtle recalibration of the body beneath. Heroin's arrival was therefore both a triumph and a pivot. It demonstrated the power of chemistry to achieve immediate, visible calm, yet it also accelerated a pattern of reliance. The body adapted to expect intervention, the mind deferred to relief, and the culture reinforced the notion that efficiency and propriety justified chemical mediation. The Victorian world, enamored with control, accepted the new compound without hesitation. Its novelty obscured its risks. Its gentleness masked its potency. Dependence, still unnamed, grew quietly, institutionalized beneath trust, precision, and expectation. Heroin promised a solution, gentle and elegant. Yet even as it soothed, it quietly taught the body a lesson, that relief could be immediate, absolute, and required, and that the cost, when measured, would be invisible, deferred, and profound. Heroin did not arrive as a novelty alone. It arrived as a solution to a solution. Morphine, once hailed for its precision, had proven both reliable and insufficient. Its effects, though predictable, were tempered by the body's adaptation. The nervous system, trained over decades of laudanum and morphine, had begun to resist, requiring incremental reinforcement. The need for something more potent, more refined, and more immediate became apparent not as a moral failing, but as a problem to be solved. Chemistry, ever faithful to the Victorian ethos of progress, provided the answer: heroin. The framing was deliberate. Heroin was presented as an improvement, a gentler, more civilized compound capable of achieving what its predecessors had promised but only partially delivered. It was marketed as a solution to the inadequacies of morphine, to the occasional suffering that persisted despite diligent administration. The implication was clear. The previous medicine had failed, and science had corrected it. This replacement was not merely chemical, it was conceptual. It taught patients to expect perfection. Relief was no longer gradual or partial. It became absolute. The body, trained by morphine to anticipate sedation, received heroin as a confirmation of what calm could be. The contrast between absence and presence was sharper, the effect more profound. Withdrawal, when it arrived, became immediate and insistent, though it remained invisible under the veneer of propriety. Physicians embraced the new compound with characteristic confidence. They prescribed it for ailments both real and abstract: persistent coughs, nervous agitation, sleeplessness, even melancholy framed as deficiency. Its precision allowed them to feel in control, even as the patient's body adapted beyond their immediate comprehension. The remedy became both shield and tool, protecting households, factories, and wards from disruption, while binding patients ever more tightly to chemical mediation. Society reinforced this substitution. Families celebrated the visible calm it produced. Mothers who slept through the night were praised. Children who lay still were admired. Soldiers returning from battle who rested quietly were considered restored. The pattern of recognition was consistent. Effectiveness validated itself, and any subtle dependency was invisible. The appearance of order was taken as confirmation of propriety and skill. Yet beneath the surface, the cost was accumulating. Heroin, more potent and immediate than morphine, trained the body to expect intervention. The nervous system recalibrated around its effects. Pain, when it returned, was intolerable not because it had intensified, but because the body had learned that it could always be erased. Relief became not merely desirable, but necessary. The Victorian world, enamored with certainty, failed to recognize that in replacing morphine, they had also replaced the natural limits of the body's endurance. What had once been a temporary solution had become an expectation, a baseline, a quiet tyranny enforced by chemistry. Dependence, still unnamed and unmeasured, grew under the auspices of care. Heroin's introduction demonstrated the seductive power of science. It could erase discomfort entirely, restore order swiftly, and affirm authority simultaneously. Yet in doing so, it accelerated a pattern whose consequences would echo through generations. The problem had been replaced, yes, but it had been replaced with something far more insidious. The lesson was subtle and almost invisible. When solutions perfect the promise of relief, they also perfect the body's expectation for it. And in that perfection, there is a cost. The laboratories of Victorian Britain were filled with the quiet hum of possibility. Flasks clinked, powders settled, and tinctures gleamed under the steady gaze of chemists convinced of their craft. Each new compound promised improvement over what had come before. Each refinement hailed as progress. Opium had softened pain. Morphine had delivered precision. Heroin now promised a gentler, more reliable relief. Science, it was believed, could solve the problem of suffering entirely. This optimism was infectious. Physicians approached their work with a confidence bordering on certainty. If a chemical could produce calm in the chaos of the ward, it could surely restore composure in the household, the factory, the battlefield. Dosages were measured with increasing exactitude, administered with deliberate hands, recorded meticulously in journals that treated compliance and calm as proof of efficacy. The successes reinforced the belief that progress had finally mastered pain itself. Yet optimism carries its own blindness. For every patient quieted by morphine or soothed by heroin, the body adapted. Nervous systems calibrated themselves to expect relief. Sleep came only with intervention. Restlessness returned when doses were withheld. Gradually, what had been extraordinary became ordinary. What had been temporary became baseline. The chemistry of calm, celebrated as triumph, had quietly begun to reshape the human nervous system, teaching it obedience. In hospitals, this optimism manifested institutionally. Wards became structured around the predictable effects of sedatives. The quiet patient was evidence of success. The obedient patient was evidence of skill. Observation focused on outward compliance rather than internal experience. A calm bed was more valuable than understanding why the calm was necessary. The staff learned to trust numbers, charts, and immediate results rather than intuition or patient testimony. Even outside hospitals, optimism framed the discussion of chemical relief. In parlors and homes, families praised calm children, attentive mothers, and quiet laborers. The visible markers of function were taken as assurance that intervention was safe. Subtle signs of tolerance, restlessness, or craving went unnoticed, misattributed to temperament, nerves, or fatigue. The social consensus reinforced the medical one. If calm prevailed, the methods must be justified. This culture of optimism extended into medicine's self-image. Physicians believed that they were not merely relieving symptoms but perfecting care. Each refinement of a compound, each innovation in administration, was a step toward mastery over the unpredictable, untamed human body. Harm was assumed avoidable, risk was managed through measurement, and failures were interpreted as anomalies rather than consequences of the very method employed. Yet the more certain the system became, the less it noticed the quiet adaptation beneath the surface. Dependency, slow and invisible, continued unremarked. Bodies learned to expect intervention. Nerves learned to anticipate sedation. Relief became a necessity rather than an option. The very confidence that celebrated calm reinforced the conditions that would later make withdrawal, craving, and tolerance inevitable. Victorian pharmaceutical optimism was not reckless. It was meticulous, rational, and seemingly benevolent. It promised to civilize pain, to regulate nerves, to restore order, and it delivered immediately, predictably, invisibly. But what it could not deliver was consequence-free relief. For every moment of calm it produced, it quietly trained the body to require more, and it shaped a society that would come to accept dependency as a measure of propriety rather than pathology. Science had promised mastery over suffering, and in keeping that promise, it had begun to teach the first lessons in obedience, expectation, and quiet submission that would echo far beyond the laboratories, into homes, hospitals, and the centuries yet to come. In the Victorian imagination, the physician's signature carried authority almost sacred in its weight. A prescription was more than a set of instructions. It was a mandate sanctioned by knowledge, training, and social trust. When written for laudanum, morphine, or the newly refined heroin, it was also, quietly, a permission slip, a signal that chemical relief was not only acceptable, but proper. The logic was unassailable. If a doctor prescribed it, the patient could take it without moral compromise. Families accepted this silently. Mothers administered drops to children without question. Husbands entrusted their wives' health to the judgment of physicians. Workers complied without suspicion. The prescription became both shield and guide. It sanctioned what society had learned to accept, that pain, unrest, or agitation required intervention. This permission was subtle in its operation. It did not announce itself with ceremony or overt proclamation. It arrived folded within the lettered lines of a physician's hand, carried in the envelope that secured respectability. By following the dosage, by observing the prescribed schedule, patients and their families were shielded from judgment. Compliance with the prescription was itself proof of propriety. Chemical relief was legitimized not by its effect, but by its endorsement. Doctors relied upon this authority to enforce order. The body, once unpredictable and noisy, could be guided by the combination of chemistry and sanction. Pain became manageable because the patient understood that obedience was proper, and the physician understood that compliance was visible. The two reinforced each other. Calm, measurable, and sanctioned replaced the unpredictable turbulence of natural sensation. Yet this permission carried consequences unrecognized at the time. The body, having learned that relief was both sanctioned and inevitable, began to expect it. Tolerance formed as nerves adjusted to repeated doses. Relief, when delayed, produced restlessness. Sleep faltered, irritability surfaced. Yet all of this occurred beneath a veneer of legitimacy. Patients could obey faithfully and still become dependent. The very structure of authority concealed the gradual imprint left upon the nervous system. Permission also transformed social expectations. Mothers who administered opiates to infants were regarded as attentive, not indulgent. Soldiers who received morphine were seen as medicated appropriately, not weakened. Even laborers, quietly dosing themselves for pain after grueling shifts, were perceived as compliant rather than compromised. The physician's endorsement reframed chemical reliance as virtue. To question the prescription was to question propriety itself. In hospitals, the effect was institutional. Prescriptions became schedules. Charts measured doses and intervals. Nurses administered relief according to authority rather than observation of subtle bodily need. Each administration reinforced the message: the drug was necessary, right, and expected. Observation became compliance, not inquiry. Patients were managed chemically, silently taught to accept intervention as the norm. Over time, the act of prescribing evolved into a cultural signal. It instructed behavior beyond the individual patient, influencing families, workplaces, and communities. Pain became negotiable not through endurance or adaptation, but through sanctioned chemical relief. Dependency was folded seamlessly into routine, its presence legitimized by authority. Victorian medicine, in codifying relief, did not merely alleviate suffering. It directed expectation, shaped obedience, and reinforced hierarchy. The prescription was a tool of care, and simultaneously, a subtle instrument of control. Relief was available, sanctioned, and proper. And with that sanction came the first silent acceptance of dependency, the quiet understanding that to obey medicine was to obey society, and that chemical calm was both permission and precedent. In the parlors and wards of Victorian Britain, the line between relief and reliance was never drawn sharply. What society observed as composure, what medicine documented as improvement, often concealed a truth that remained unspoken. The body was learning to depend on intervention, even as the mind and family interpreted it as recovery. Addiction existed, but its shape was subtle, its appearance respectable. A patient administered laudanum or morphine, or later heroin, returned to quiet function. A child who had previously cried through the night now slept. A mother who had once trembled through domestic duties now moved through them with apparent steadiness. A soldier who had been restless and anxious during convalescence now rested, compliant, orderly. These outcomes were celebrated. Relief was heralded as triumph. Recovery, however fleeting or incomplete, was assumed. The reality beneath this surface was otherwise. Dependence, slow and insidious, was forming with each measured dose. The nervous system adapted to the chemical presence, calibrating its expectation around regular relief. Sleep, calm, and comfort became contingent upon intervention. What had been administered as treatment became, without fanfare, a requirement. The distinction between therapeutic aid and chemical reliance blurred. The patient, family, and physician alike interpreted the resulting calm as recovery, unaware that the body's obedience was the cost of that calm. Physicians seldom recognized this transformation. Their observations were guided by measurable outcomes: pain reduction, restfulness, compliance. A quiet ward confirmed authority. A composed household confirmed propriety. Subtle signs of adaptation, restlessness when a dose was delayed, the increasingly frequent need for intervention were rationalized as individual variation, the progression of disease, or the fragility of temperament. Chemistry, precise and controlled, remained beyond reproach. This misunderstanding was reinforced socially. Families praised composure, celebrated calm children, admired attentive mothers. The hallmarks of dependence were mistaken for virtue, and the invisible cost was rendered unremarkable. Workers who relied upon opiate solutions returned to labor efficiently, and their quiet endurance was seen as resilience, not chemical obedience. Even when side effects were observable, flattened affect, emotional dulling, irritability between doses, they were interpreted as weakness, fatigue, or constitution rather than consequence. The language of recovery concealed the truth. Success was measured by visible calm, not by the nervous system's altered baseline. Addiction was disguised as rehabilitation. Relief was framed as accomplishment. The patient had adapted, but adaptation was misread as healing. Each dose administered in the name of care reinforced the very reliance it masked. This disguise extended into institutions. Hospitals, military convalescent wards, and pharmacies recorded improvement in charts, observed behavior, and outcomes, but rarely probed the internal changes wrought by repeated chemical intervention. The narrative of care depended upon calm, compliance, and order. Dependence, invisible and insidious, remained compatible with this narrative. The Victorian world, eager to measure success in observable terms, overlooked the quiet, cumulative lesson the body was imparting, that relief, once tasted and regular, becomes expected. Recovery was declared not because the underlying state had changed, but because the appearance of order had returned. The patient learned obedience, the family learned trust, medicine learned confidence. What was taken as recovery was, in truth, preparation. The nervous system, disciplined chemically, awaited the next intervention, calibrated to require it. The society that celebrated calm had inadvertently trained dependence to masquerade as virtue. Relief, respectable and sanctioned, had taught obedience. And the body, unobserved, had learned to expect it. The laboratory had become the true center of authority. Beyond the parlors, beyond the wards, beyond the polite consultations in quiet rooms, chemistry itself was asserting dominion over the human body. Victorian science had moved from observation to orchestration, and in doing so, it redefined what it meant to treat, to heal, and, most subtly, to command. Opium had been ubiquitous, but unpredictable. Morphine had introduced precision. Heroin offered refinement, yet all had depended upon human hands, discretion, and intuition. The laboratory promised to remove uncertainty entirely. Here, compounds could be isolated, purified, measured with unerring accuracy. Each milligram was known, each reaction anticipated. The body, once variable, could now be confronted with a predictable, repeatable intervention. Physicians and chemists alike began to rely upon this control. They trusted the clarity of the formula more than the vagaries of patient report. If a dose produced quiet and compliance, it confirmed both method and authority. If it failed, the fault was rarely assigned to chemistry. It was the body that was considered insufficient, the nerves that were delicate, the temperament that was flawed. The laboratory had provided certainty, failure lay elsewhere. This shift carried profound consequences. Relief became an object of calculation. The patient's response was secondary to the dosage. Symptoms were coded into charts. Outcomes were interpreted numerically. The human experience of pain, suffering, or agitation was subordinated to chemical predictability. The body learned to obey the laboratory's instructions, whether it understood them or not. Dependence, emerging silently across homes and wards, was reinforced by this system. Each administration was validated by authority. Each measurement suggested precision. Each repetition implied safety. Patients, trained by decades of incremental chemical intervention, adjusted their baseline expectation for relief. Sleep was no longer a function of circadian rhythm or environment. It became a function of milligrams and drops, measured, recorded, and sanctioned. The laboratory did not merely refine compounds, it reshaped the relationship between patient and medicine. Autonomy was ceded to procedure. Observation became compliance. Restlessness, agitation, or withdrawal were interpreted through the lens of error of dosage, timing, or patient constitution, never through the lens of the body's adaptation to repeated chemical interference. The nervous system recalibrated, learning obedience where once there had been natural fluctuation. Social perception reinforced this dynamic. Families observed calm children and quiet mothers, and assumed the compound had cured, comforted, or restored. Doctors recorded success in journals, measured in compliance and outward order. The veneer of propriety and discipline masked what had changed internally. The body had been trained to require intervention, the mind had been taught to accept it, and the culture had normalized it. Even dissent was subdued by trust. To question a compound, refined and administered with laboratory precision, was to challenge not merely a physician, but the very progress of science itself. Authority had shifted from bedside discretion to chemical certainty. Obedience was now both expected and engineered. In this era, the laboratory dictated more than care, it dictated expectation. The human body, trained by decades of chemical intervention, learned to anticipate relief as both right and necessary. Dependency, though invisible, was woven into the fabric of treatment, sanctioned by precision and authority alike. Science had claimed its dominion, and, in claiming it, it had begun to teach the body not just to obey, but to demand. The promise of relief had long ceased to be purely medical. By the late Victorian era, it had become commerce. Opium, morphine, and heroin flowed not only through wards and parlors, but through markets, pharmacies, and the hands of chemists eager to demonstrate the fruits of innovation. Profit followed the path of obedience. Where the body expected chemical intervention, the market responded. Where trust sanctioned administration, commerce expanded. This was not scandalous in the conventional sense. The Victorian mind, enamored with progress, saw profit as a natural reward for ingenuity. A compound that eased suffering, restored calm, and ensured functionality was both beneficial and marketable. Chemists measured not only dosage but demand. If a formula produced quiet children, composed mothers, and compliant laborers, it was successful by any metric, moral or financial. Manufacturers and apothecaries quickly realized the advantage of reliability. Pure compounds could be produced in quantity, standardized, and packaged for distribution. Each bottle of laudanum, each vial of morphine, each ampule of heroin carried a promise of efficacy. Sales were reinforced by societal trust. If the physician prescribed it, the patient could consume it without moral doubt. Commerce and medical authority became interlaced, each legitimizing the other. Yet profit required little reckoning. The dangers, subtle and invisible, were externalized. Dependence, tolerance, emotional flattening, withdrawal, all were consequences that unfolded quietly, often unnoticed until widespread. No one questioned the ethics of volume when the product functioned perfectly in the moment. The nervous system, trained to obey chemical expectation, silently became the guarantor of continued demand. Compliance and calm produced revenue as surely as they produced order. This financial dimension shaped distribution. Access to relief was stratified. Those with means, families able to pay, institutions able to purchase, received precise compounds in measured doses. The working classes, although exposed, were more likely to receive diluted or adulterated forms, yet still learned the patterns of reliance. Commerce, in this sense, not only facilitated relief but enforced hierarchy. Obedience became a currency as much as propriety. Even the medical establishment benefited indirectly. Hospitals and physicians, observing the success of chemical intervention in patient compliance and outcomes, reinforced the system by prescribing, administering, and advocating for availability. The chemical solution became normalized, not only as medicine but as commodity. The market responded. Orders increased. Production expanded. Distribution widened. Each transaction reinforced the pattern, embedding chemical expectation into daily life. What was invisible to all except perhaps the body itself was the slow accrual of dependence across households, wards, and cities. The market rewarded repetition and regularity. The laboratory refined potency. The physician administered precision. And the patient's nervous system adapted, internalizing expectation, obedience, and need. Profit, in this era, was a silent partner in training bodies to rely upon relief. In this alignment of commerce, authority, and chemistry, reckoning was deferred indefinitely. The appearance of calm was sufficient evidence of benefit. The invisible cost, the alteration of the nervous system, the creation of expectation, the quiet birth of dependence was discounted, overlooked, or rationalized. Efficiency, order, and satisfaction trumped scrutiny. Profit followed obedience. Order justified intervention. And the body, trained to comply, became both consumer and guarantor. The Victorian world had mastered calm, refined it, sold it, and measured it. What it had not mastered was the consequence of giving relief such unquestioned authority. What began as relief quietly became ritual, and what was ritual quietly became expectation. By the late Victorian era, the administration of opiates had evolved into a cycle so normalized that it no longer required justification. It simply persisted, invisible beneath propriety and reinforced by authority. The very solution that had soothed pain, calmed nerves, and softened grief now carried the seeds of its own recurrence. The cycle was subtle. A child, once comforted by a few drops of laudanum, grew accustomed to calm being chemically produced. Sleep arrived not through fatigue or rhythm, but through prescription. When awakenings were disrupted, more was administered. Mothers, taught to value composure above all, reached automatically for the bottle, unaware that repetition was quietly instructing the nervous system. Relief became expectation. Dependence, unnamed and unobserved, wove itself into domestic routine. In the wards, the cycle took on a more formal guise. Physicians noted patterns in charts. Doses were repeated, adjusted slightly over time, justified scientifically. A patient who returned for relief did so not through moral failing but through biology, conditioned by repetition. Calm was observed, recorded, celebrated. The quiet ward was proof that the method worked, even as the nervous system adapted beyond immediate notice. Heroin, with its potent immediacy, accelerated the process. Its introduction did not disrupt the pattern, it intensified it. Relief became faster, more complete, and the contrast between presence and absence more pronounced. Patients learned quickly that agitation and discomfort would yield only to chemical intervention. The cycle reinforced itself. Anticipation of relief, administration of substance, temporary calm, return to baseline, and renewed expectation. Each iteration strengthened the dependence, yet framed it as medical care, propriety, or progress. Society, too, participated in the cycle. Families valued visible composure and measured success by compliance, not sensation. Workplaces, factories, and schools rewarded function rather than introspection. The very culture of Victorian life reinforced that calm was both desirable and necessary. Where pain persisted, it was framed as weakness. Where agitation returned, it was interpreted as moral or nervous deficiency. The cycle, though chemical in operation, was social in reinforcement. Even physicians, aware of repeated administration, rarely questioned the system. To do so would challenge authority, disrupt trust, and question the very definition of propriety. Efficiency, order, and compliance were the measures of success. The nervous system's recalibration, its silent training to expect chemical intervention, was invisible to the metrics used to assess care. Each prescription validated the cycle, reinforcing both dependence and authority. The lesson of the cycle was profound. Intervention, when repeated and sanctioned, becomes expectation. Relief, once tasted, is remembered. Obedience is learned. The body, calibrated to chemical calm, resists absence. What began as a solution transforms into a structural condition, quietly dictating behavior, shaping desire, and instructing reliance. The Victorian era had normalized more than opium. It had normalized expectation. It had taught the nervous system obedience, and it had framed that obedience as virtue. And in this quiet, repeating rhythm, the first true pattern of modern chemical reliance had been established unseen, unquestioned, and perfectly legitimate in the eyes of the world. In the quiet corridors of Victorian medicine, caution existed, but it was muted. It lived not in spoken counsel, but in journals, reports, and footnotes, pages of careful observation buried beneath layers of prescription, dosage charts, and case studies. The warnings were there, recorded meticulously by the few who noticed, yet they were almost immediately eclipsed by confidence in chemistry, authority, and propriety. Physicians observed phenomena that were subtle yet consistent. Patients returned sooner than expected for doses. Sleep fractured without chemical assistance. Restlessness and irritability appeared when the medicine was withheld. In some cases, even physical tolerance became apparent. Doses, once sufficient, were now inadequate. These observations were dutifully noted. Journals reported them with the precision expected of science: dates, quantities, patient notes. But the language was careful. Terms such as sensitive constitution or nervous disposition often replaced what we would now call dependence. By codifying concern in paperwork rather than action, the system deferred responsibility. Doctors could record their observations without challenging established practice. The substance itself remained beyond reproach. Its administration was sanctioned, measured, and, most importantly, socially and professionally approved. Concern was acknowledged only as data, abstracted from the lived experience of the patient, and therefore stripped of urgency. Hospitals, too, reinforced this concealment. Casebooks held entries of repeated dosing and prolonged use, yet the emphasis remained on compliance and outcome rather than adaptation. Quiet wards, calm patients, and orderly charts were celebrated as success, while the slow accumulation of tolerance or subtle withdrawal symptoms was absorbed into routine notation. What might have suggested systemic caution was rendered invisible beneath the structure of record-keeping. Families, too, participated unknowingly. When physicians recorded that a child or mother required repeated doses, it reinforced the belief that chemical intervention was correct, necessary, and even beneficial. The household, interpreting paperwork as authority, complied. The warnings embedded in careful marginalia never reached the public eye, never reached the mind of those administering care daily. Dependence remained hidden behind propriety and respectability. Even the chemical manufacturers were shielded by paperwork. Laboratory results, purity tests, and dosing guidelines provided evidence of precision and safety. Any cautionary notes, side effects, observed tolerance, subtle adaptation were catalogued for reference, yet rarely acted upon beyond minor adjustments. The data existed, but it was abstract, detached from the immediacy of patient experience. Authority, bolstered by documentation, maintained confidence. The effect of burying warnings in paperwork was profound. The body, having adapted to repeated chemical intervention, continued to demand relief. Patients, trusting in authority and propriety, complied. The nervous system, reinforced by regular doses, began to anticipate chemical moderation as natural. The quiet signals, the tremors, the agitation, the brief awakenings, the restless nights were recorded but never treated as urgent. The lessons of adaptation went unheeded. In this way, Victorian medicine institutionalized oversight without intervention. Paperwork became both shield and veil. It protected authority from doubt and concealed the slow accrual of dependence. Observation was formalized. Action was delayed. The warnings existed, but they were muted, indirect, and powerless against the momentum of chemical expectation. Thus, the very mechanism meant to preserve careful practice, meticulous recording, served instead to normalize reliance. The system trusted itself more than it trusted the body, and in doing so, created the quiet foundation for dependency that would echo far beyond the gaslit wards of the 19th century. The caution was written, but it was unread, and the body, unheeded, continued to learn obedience. Even the most carefully constructed facades show fissures. For decades, Victorian society had relied upon chemical intervention to maintain calm, order, and propriety. Laudanum for the household, morphine for the hospital, heroin for refinement. Each substance was administered under authority, measured for precision, and celebrated for its visible effect. Calm children, composed mothers, and compliant laborers were proof of success. Quiet wards, orderly factories, and attentive soldiers reinforced the belief that chemical relief was both proper and effective. Yet beneath this veneer, the body was learning its own lesson, that relief could be expected, required, and demanded. These lessons were subtle but accumulating. Patients tolerated increasingly potent doses. Children became accustomed to quiet only under chemical guidance. Mothers, already burdened by expectation, learned to reach instinctively for the bottle. Soldiers who had endured trauma under morphine returned home altered, expecting calm to be immediate and total. The nervous system, trained over decades, recalibrated its baseline. Pain, agitation, and restlessness no longer existed as natural signals. They were reminders that intervention was necessary. And then, quietly, cracks began to appear. In households, some children became restless between doses, their agitation noticeable even in polite parlors. Mothers reported tremors or emotional flattening that could not be attributed to nerves alone. Families, previously reassured by outward calm, began to notice that the very absence of complaint no longer guaranteed contentment or resilience. What had been hidden beneath propriety and authority began to surface. In hospitals, the patterns were similar but more formal. Ward nurses and physicians recorded cases of tolerance, repeated administration, and subtle withdrawal. Charts grew longer, notes more detailed. Yet the system, confident in its precision, largely interpreted these signs as anomalies, exceptions, or sensitivity. Authority assumed correctness. The cycle of relief continued, now reinforced by necessity rather than comfort. Even the broader social perception began to falter. Factories observed laborers who required more rest between shifts or whose efficiency declined without chemical moderation. Clergy noted households where grief returned despite careful administration of laudanum. Military convalescent wards found soldiers increasingly dependent upon morphine to maintain composure. The surface remained polished, but these deviations could no longer be fully concealed. These cracks revealed an inconvenient truth. Chemical relief had consequences that could not be managed solely through authority or propriety. Dependence, tolerance, and adaptation were no longer invisible. The very trust that had justified repeated administration now highlighted its cost. Yet the logic of the era resisted acknowledgement. Relief was still framed as proper. Compliance remained virtuous. Calm was still celebrated, even when it was artificially maintained. The fissures were most evident in moments of absence. A dose withheld, delayed, or diminished produced unrest, previously unimaginable. The body had been taught obedience, now it demanded it. Families, physicians, and institutions were forced to recognize that calm, however respectable, came at a price. The Victorian world had mastered appearances, measured compliance, and enforced propriety. Yet the first cracks had formed. Behind the curtains, beneath the quiet wards, and within the disciplined households, the lesson was clear. Chemical relief could be trusted to deliver calm, but it could not erase dependence. Respectability was no longer sufficient to conceal the cost. And the society that had prized composure above all would soon have to reckon with what lay beneath it. What had been subdued now demanded attention. Victorian confidence in chemical relief had long masked the body's persistent voice. Laudanum, morphine, heroin, all had taught nerves to anticipate intervention. Calm was no longer a privilege, it had become a requirement. For decades, society had measured success by visible order, by quiet children, composed mothers, compliant laborers, and silent wards. Yet beneath this surface, the body's memory of relief had grown insistent, and the first tremors of crisis began to manifest. Pain, once deferred or softened, returned with a harsh clarity. The signals were subtle but unmistakable. Restlessness, when a dose was delayed, insomnia that could not be quelled by routine, agitation that flared without apparent cause. Families, accustomed to chemical obedience, were unsettled. The child who slept obediently under laudanum now awoke, crying between doses. The mother who had appeared composed for years trembled at moments of tension, her calm no longer reliable. The laborer who had endured the workday with the aid of morphine found himself faltering when relief was interrupted. Physicians observed these disruptions, but interpretation remained framed by authority and expectation. They recorded the symptoms meticulously, noting dosage, timing, and apparent compliance. Yet they rarely recognized the underlying cause: adaptation. The nervous system had been trained to expect chemical intervention, and its absence now produced distress that was both real and immediate. Pain was no longer a signal to be soothed leisurely. It was a crisis in miniature, demanding action to restore calm. Hospitals, confident in protocols and guided by charts, responded predictably. Doses were adjusted upward, administration was repeated more frequently, and the cycle continued. Calm was restored, but only temporarily. The body, conditioned over decades, learned quickly to anticipate intervention. Tolerance deepened. Dependence, though unspoken, became increasingly visible in behavior and physiology. The very measure of success, quiet, compliant patients, now reflected not restoration, but necessity. The social dimension amplified the crisis. Families, previously reassured by composure, began to notice inconsistencies. Children required more attention between doses. Mothers experienced tremors or emotional flattening despite following instructions faithfully. Workplaces observed laborers whose productivity was inconsistent without chemical moderation. Clergy and social observers, attuned to propriety, sensed unease even where appearances remained superficially intact. The body's insistence had begun to pierce the veil of social expectation. Even military medicine, once reliant on morphine to maintain composure under duress, began to recognize the fragility of chemical obedience. Soldiers returning from battle, previously calmed and compliant, showed signs of heightened agitation when doses were unavailable. The nervous system, trained for immediate relief, could no longer function without it. The crisis was not dramatic, yet it was undeniable. Victorian medicine had long prized order above insight. Calm was the measure of health. Compliance was proof of efficacy. Yet the return of pain revealed a fundamental miscalculation. The body's adaptation could not be erased, and chemical relief, no matter how precise, could not substitute for resilience. What had once been a solution had now become a problem. Pain, deferred, insistent, and amplified by expectation, demanded intervention. The calm that had been celebrated as proof of success was no longer sustainable without constant reinforcement. And in that quiet escalation, society glimpsed the truth it had long refused to confront. Relief, when made ordinary, carries consequences that are immediate, persistent, and impossible to ignore. Pain had returned. And the crisis was only beginning. By the early 20th century, Victorian ingenuity had evolved into something more absolute. Chemistry no longer sought merely to refine nature, it sought to surpass it. Heroin had been praised as a gentler, more reliable alternative to morphine. Now, new compounds promised synthetic perfection. These substances were designed in laboratories, measured in precise quantities, standardized for potency, and marketed under the auspices of modern science. They offered calm beyond what nature or previous chemistry had provided, but they also carried the hidden burden of expectation learned over decades. The ideal was seductive. Relief could be immediate, consistent, and complete. No longer would variability in tincture or plant source diminish effect. No longer would the nervous system endure partial sedation. Synthetic compounds promised to deliver calm without compromise, to satisfy both physician and patient alike. In hospitals, parlors, and military wards, the promise was received as progress realized. The chemical solution, now perfected, seemed to meet every need the Victorian ethos had created: to maintain order, to quiet nerves, to ensure productivity and propriety. Yet perfection brought with it a new intensity. The body, trained for decades to expect relief, responded eagerly to these synthetic agents. Nervous systems, conditioned by laudanum, morphine, and heroin, accepted the new compounds with near immediate obedience. Sleep was restored instantly, restlessness vanished, agitation faded. The experience felt miraculous, reinforcing trust in both medicine and chemistry. But what was invisible in the moment was the subtle, cumulative adaptation occurring within the body itself. Baselines of sensation had shifted. Pain, once manageable without intervention, now appeared intolerable without it. Calm had become requirement. Dependency had become expectation. Physicians, proud of their laboratory's achievements, rarely questioned the long-term consequences. The potency of these synthetic compounds seemed to confirm their efficacy. Charts documented perfect outcomes: quiet wards, orderly hospitals, compliant patients. The metrics of success were visible, immediate, and reassuring. What lay beneath the recalibration of the nervous system, the subtle shaping of expectation, the quiet accrual of need, remained largely undetected. Society embraced these new chemicals with the same confidence it had afforded their predecessors. Families celebrated composure, productivity, and emotional restraint. Work continued efficiently. Children slept. Mothers remained attentive. Soldiers, returning from service, found relief that seemed precise, predictable, and permanent. Commerce thrived. Laboratories expanded. Pharmacies stocked supply. The culture of calm was reinforced through both observation and trust. And yet, synthetic perfection carried a cost that no chart or journal could fully capture. The body, habituated to the immediacy and intensity of intervention, began to demand it. Withdrawal, when doses were delayed, was sharper. Tolerance deepened. Emotional flatness, restlessness, and irritability became frequent companions. What had once been a gentle correction became a structural expectation, invisible yet absolute. In pursuing perfection, Victorian medicine and its successors had refined not only the chemistry of relief but the nervous system's obedience. The body had been trained over decades to expect, to rely upon, and to require intervention. The synthetic agents of the early 20th century perfected the lesson. Calm could be immediate, complete, and repeatable, but it would never be free. Science had achieved its ideal. The body had learned to obey it. and in that obedience lay the quiet inheritance of dependence, perfected, invisible, and unstoppable. By the time synthetic compounds had perfected the promise of calm, the mechanism of relief had expanded beyond the home, the ward, and even the battlefield. Relief, once administered individually, now moved in quantities sufficient to touch society itself. Factories, hospitals, and pharmacies became nodes in a network of chemical distribution, delivering sedation not as an intimate intervention, but as a coordinated system. The scale was unprecedented. Factories relied upon it. Laborers whose bodies had long endured unyielding schedules found their aches softened, their fatigue muted, their nerves quieted by a combination of chemistry and authority. Employers observed steady productivity and disciplined compliance. Children of working families, already exposed to tinctures for teething or sleeplessness, received measured doses that allowed parents to maintain households with the appearance of ease. Relief had become infrastructure, woven into the very operations of industry, ensuring that the machinery of society could continue without disruption. Hospitals, too, embraced the scale of intervention. Wards were stocked with compounds in precise quantities. Nurses administered doses on schedules calculated for efficiency and compliance. Physicians monitored, adjusted, and recorded, yet the observations were guided by immediate calm rather than long-term consequence. A quiet bed was proof of efficacy. A tranquil ward was proof of control. The patient's nervous system, conditioned over decades of exposure to opiates, adapted quickly, learning that chemical intervention would always be available, always sanctioned, and always expected. Pharmacies multiplied access. Apothecaries provided both the visible products and the tacit assurance that chemical relief was correct, safe, and respectable. Families, soldiers, laborers all could participate in this system, guided by prescriptions and authority, reassured that reliance was proper. Commerce and care merged seamlessly. Profit flowed as calm circulated. The network of distribution reinforced expectation. Dependency, though largely invisible, became systemic. Yet the very efficiency that permitted relief at industrial scale also amplified risk. The nervous system, trained to expect immediate chemical response, recalibrated its baseline. Pain, fatigue, agitation, once endured naturally, now became intolerable in the absence of intervention. The body demanded the dose it had learned to anticipate. Withdrawal, subtle at first, intensified with repetition. Tolerance accumulated, and all of this unfolded beneath the polished veneer of societal propriety. Families, employers, and physicians observed calm, compliance, and productivity, unaware of the internal shifts shaping the next generation of expectation. This scale also allowed the culture of chemical obedience to solidify. Children who slept under laudanum or morphine grew into adults whose first instinct was intervention. Mothers who had relied upon sedation for decades carried the expectation forward. Soldiers returning from service integrated chemical relief into routines at home. The cycle repeated itself with each generation, normalized, legitimized, and largely unquestioned. Relief at industrial scale was not merely chemical, it was social, economic, and moral. And yet, the body learned faster than society noticed. Each dose reinforced expectation, each administration taught dependence, each cycle deepened adaptation. Efficiency, order, and calm were celebrated, but the cost altered nervous systems, recalibrated sensation, and quiet reliance remained invisible. The Victorian promise of relief, once intimate and individualized, had now become a systemic force. Calm, compliance, and productivity were delivered at scale. But the body, quietly and inevitably, had learned to demand it. Relief had become expectation, and expectation had become law. The hospital, once a sanctuary for healing, had quietly transformed into a conduit, an intersection between authority, chemistry, and expectation. In the dim lamplight of Victorian wards, where the scent of antiseptic mingled with the faintly sweet aroma of opiates, relief was no longer merely administered. It was taught. The patient arrived, body tense, nerves frayed, and left having internalized the lesson. Calm could be delivered, and calm would be expected. Physicians embraced this shift with confidence. The ward's rhythm was orchestrated around chemical intervention, schedules for laudanum, morphine, or heroin, precise dosing measured in milligrams, meticulous notation in casebooks. The body, repeatedly exposed to these interventions, adjusted its baseline. Pain, agitation, restlessness once experienced as natural signals were softened, muted, and rendered contingent upon chemical relief. The hospital had become a laboratory in which the nervous system was trained to obey. Visitors seldom perceived the subtle transformation. A quiet child, a composed mother, a sleeping patient, all suggested success. Calm was interpreted as health, compliance as virtue. The signs of emerging dependence, restlessness between doses, irritability when relief was delayed, the subtle craving for the reassurance of chemical intervention were invisible to the untrained eye. Authority was reinforced, and in reinforcing authority, the hospital had become a gateway, transmitting expectation from practitioner to patient. This system extended beyond individual wards. Surgical recovery depended upon sedation. Laboring mothers were calmed with measured doses. Chronic patients were maintained on a regimen that blurred the line between treatment and maintenance. Every administration reinforced the lesson. The body had learned obedience, and the mind had learned trust. Relief, sanctioned by authority, became expectation. Even the broader culture reinforced this dynamic. Families left patients in the hands of hospitals with confidence, observing calm and assuming competence. Workplaces, aware of hospital discharge practices, relied on chemically stabilized laborers. Society accepted that intervention was proper, even necessary. The hospital's authority had become a social authority, dictating not only treatment but behavior, expectation, and reliance. Yet the costs of this transformation remained unseen. Dependence accumulated quietly. Tolerance emerged subtly. The body's nervous system recalibrated around chemical presence, internalizing relief as standard rather than exceptional. Withdrawal, when relief was unavailable, produced agitation and distress, misinterpreted as fragility or sensitivity. The hospital, designed to heal, had become the first site of instruction in compliance, conditioning, and expectation. Medical authority, confidence in chemistry, and societal trust converged in the wards. The hospital delivered more than care, it delivered a precedent. Patients learned that calm could be summoned on command, and that relief, once tasted, would be expected. The institution, structured around observation and control, reinforced patterns of reliance before they could be questioned. Thus, hospitals became gateways, conduits through which chemical expectation passed from authority to patient, from generation to generation, quiet, invisible, and absolute. The body adapted, the mind deferred, and society applauded the calm that was maintained, unaware of the dependence being woven into the fabric of life. What had once been refuge had become instruction. What had once been treatment had become expectation. And the lessons taught in the quiet wards of Victorian hospitals would echo far beyond their walls, shaping the nervous system and the culture of reliance for decades to come. The authority of medicine, for all its polish and propriety, depended upon a carefully maintained separation. The physician administered, the patient received, and the consequences were assumed manageable. Relief, dispensed through laudanum, morphine, or heroin, was framed as professional, scientific, and objective. It was administered from a distance both literal and figurative, and this distance created an illusion. The body, though obedient, was quietly adapting, and the society that trusted the procedure failed to see the subtle consequences emerging beneath the veneer of calm. Doctors, confident in dosage and observation, rarely considered the body's internal recalibration. They recorded sleep, quietude, and compliance as proof of efficacy. They noted agitation only insofar as it deviated from the expected pattern. Nervous tremors, subtle cravings, and growing tolerance were translated into charts, footnotes, and marginal remarks rarely acted upon, often rationalized as sensitivity or constitution. Authority maintained distance not only from the body's response but from responsibility for its adaptation. This distance was reinforced by language. Terms like restored calm, controlled agitation, or nervous disorder framed chemical relief as outcome rather than intervention. The patient's experience, how the body adjusted, how the nervous system learned to expect sedation, was obscured by terminology that emphasized objectivity and propriety. Success was measured by visible order: quiet wards, compliant children, attentive mothers, productive laborers. What the patient learned internally was largely invisible. Families, too, accepted this illusion. Trust in medical authority meant that administration was rarely questioned. Children who slept under laudanum were assumed healthy. Mothers who remained composed under repeated sedation were assumed resilient. The cost of adaptation, the quiet, internal reshaping of expectation, was overlooked. Calm was interpreted as health, compliance as virtue, and dependence as proper management. Even the patient's own perception was shaped by the illusion. Relief arrived predictably. Agitation, discomfort, and restlessness receded under supervision. The body came to expect intervention as routine. Withdrawal, when it occurred, was misinterpreted as illness or fragility. Autonomy over sensation was ceded, yet the patient rarely recognized it. The chemical presence created a temporary equilibrium, and the mind deferred to the authority that produced it. Hospitals became the most concentrated expression of this phenomenon. Nurses followed schedules, physicians adjusted dosages, and the quiet ward confirmed that the system worked. Each administration reinforced the lesson. Relief was available, safe, and sanctioned. The nervous system, trained to expect chemical intervention, adapted to obedience. The gap between experience and observation widened. What the practitioner saw was calm, what the patient felt was necessity. This illusion of medical distance created a persistent blind spot. Dependency developed silently. The body learned patterns of expectation. Tolerance accumulated. The culture of calm, reinforced by authority and propriety, masked the slow accrual of need. The system appeared to succeed because outcomes were measured externally, not internally. The very metric of success, visible calm, ensured that reliance remained unexamined. Medicine had perfected the appearance of care while maintaining distance from its consequence. The patient complied. The body adapted. Authority remained unquestioned. Calm was achieved, but it came at the quiet cost of expectation and dependence. The physician's hand delivered relief. The nervous system learned obedience, and the illusion of distance concealed the truth that would echo long into the future. The instruction of dependence was no longer confined to parlors or wards. It seeped outward, carried by the very commerce that sustained it. Pharmacies, apothecaries, and chemists extended their reach beyond the home, beyond the hospital, beyond the disciplined supervision of authority. The street itself became a classroom, and chemistry, once the tool of the physician, became a tutor for the masses. In urban alleys and bustling markets, opiates and their derivatives were available not only by prescription but through informal channels. The products themselves, laudanum, morphine, early heroin, were familiar, trusted, and remarkably consistent. Their potency was precise enough to reassure, their effects swift enough to demonstrate efficacy. Families and individuals alike learned, sometimes without guidance, The rhythms of administration, the timing, the dosage, the subtle cues for repetition. Relief was observed and replicated, measured and normalized. The street, in effect, became an extension of the laboratory. Ordinary people, exposed to the products in controlled contexts at first dispensed for cough, pain, or sleeplessness, began to internalize the lesson the nervous system had been taught for generations. Calm could be summoned chemically, and that calm could be expected to recur. Children watched adults dose themselves to achieve composure. Mothers noted that their own agitation softened with a spoonful of tincture. Laborers saw that function could be restored with a simple solution. Relief became ordinary, reliable, and, ultimately, demanded. This dissemination was subtle yet profound. What had been carefully observed and administered under professional authority now operated under social and cultural authority. The street had no physicians, no charts, no footnotes. Yet the knowledge was preserved. The chemical worked, it was trusted, and it could be repeated. Tolerance emerged, as it always had, but recognition of its presence lagged behind observation. Adaptation became invisible. Expectation became internalized. Pharmacies, in particular, reinforced this pattern. Their advertisements, their polished displays, their authority lent legitimacy to chemical use outside the home. A child's cough could be soothed. A mother's nerves could be quieted. A laborer's backache could be eased. The instruction was implicit. If relief is available, it is proper to use it. If it works, it must be safe. No one questioned the cumulative effect. No one measured the slow accrual of dependence. Even social networks became conduits for learning. Knowledge of what worked, in what quantity, and for whom passed from neighbor to neighbor, family to family. Recipes, dosages, and schedules were communicated quietly, validated by experience, reinforced by observed calm. The street learned chemistry in the same manner that wards and homes had taught it for decades. The lesson was consistent. Calm is achievable through chemical intervention, obedience is rewarded, and expectation is appropriate. This diffusion marked a critical evolution. Dependence was no longer an individual or familial phenomenon. It became structural, social, and cultural. The nervous system, trained by generations of exposure, began to expect intervention before discomfort could manifest fully. Observation of efficacy reinforced legitimacy. The appearance of calm masked the presence of adaptation. The street learned quietly, efficiently, and without resistance. And with each repetition, the lesson was reinforced. Relief is not merely permissible, it is necessary. The nervous system, society, and commerce had conspired together, and dependency had become invisible, normalized, and inevitable. By the time chemical relief had reached streets, parlors, wards, and factories alike, its consequences began to emerge in a form that was at once clinical and abstract. Numbers. Overdose, once a rarity obscured in private homes or whispered about in apothecaries, became a statistic. It was catalogued, quantified, and sanitized. The language of calamity was replaced by ledger entries, medical reports, and newspaper columns. Death was measured, and in that measurement, it became impersonal, detached from the suffering of the body it had claimed. In hospitals, physicians recorded outcomes with meticulous precision. Doses, times of administration, patient histories, and symptoms were logged. When chemical relief failed, when tolerance escalated to crisis, the resulting collapse was noted, coded, and compartmentalized. The death of a patient, tragic, intimate, irreversible, was reduced to an entry: cause, quantity, circumstance. Individual stories were erased, replaced by abstraction. The focus was shifted from experience to control, from grief to measure, from the lived body to the regulated system. This abstraction extended into the wider public consciousness. Newspapers reported overdoses as cases, rather than tragedies, statistics rather than loss. Families bound by propriety rarely discussed their own in private. Shame, stigma, and disbelief discouraged acknowledgement. The pattern was consistent. Where personal suffering should have provoked inquiry, it instead produced data, and the narrative of calm and authority remained intact. The body, conditioned to anticipate chemical intervention, was quietly yielding to expectation even as numbers mounted. The Victorian mind embraced this abstraction because it reassured. Statistics implied comprehension, control, and distance. If the frequency of overdose could be tabulated, it could be predicted, managed, and contained. Society could continue to trust that physicians and chemists were acting responsibly, even when the underlying nervous systems of patients had been fundamentally altered. Calm appeared preserved, mortality became quantifiable. The illusion of mastery persisted. Yet within these numbers lay subtle truths ignored. Each overdose reflected the cumulative effect of expectation, compliance, and tolerance. The patient, trained to anticipate chemical relief, experienced withdrawal and heightened sensitivity when it was absent. The body, in response, demanded more. The dosage that once provided comfort now carried risk, a risk abstracted by authority and distance. Death became a statistical artifact, an endpoint that masked the ongoing transformation of the living nervous system. Even social institutions reinforced this abstraction. Factories measured productivity rather than suffering. Hospitals measured compliance rather than sensation. Families measured visible calm rather than internal distress. The metrics of order and efficiency overshadowed the lived experience of dependence. The statistics of overdose were acknowledged, but only as anomalies, exceptions to the otherwise functional system. The underlying lesson, the nervous system's adaptation, the culture of expectation, the quiet entrenchment of reliance remained invisible. In this manner, the Victorian era codified tragedy into abstraction. Death became a number, dependence became normalized, expectation became structural. Calm, so long prized, remained, but at a profound and often unrecognized cost. Overdose existed quietly, and yet universally, as proof that chemical obedience had been perfected, but also as a warning, obscured in measurement, that the cost of that obedience was never trivial. The body learned its limits. Society noted the numbers, and the cost, personal, intimate, inevitable, was hidden behind the ledger of progress. By the turn of the century, the logic that had governed chemical intervention in Victorian parlors, wards, and factories had grown more sophisticated, yet it remained fundamentally the same. Pain was to be managed, nerves to be soothed, and disorder to be suppressed. What had begun with opium in amber bottles had evolved through morphine and heroin, and now, with the tools of modern chemistry, purified compounds, precise syringes, standardized dosages, the promise of control seemed absolute. The lessons of obedience, learned by the nervous system over decades, were reinforced, intensified, and extended into every facet of life. Physicians approached their work with confidence born of tradition and refinement. Laboratory methods provided compounds of near-perfect purity. Dosing instruments delivered measurable quantities with exactitude, and administration schedules were calibrated to maintain visible calm. Each patient was treated according to protocol, each effect recorded meticulously, and each outcome evaluated against standardized expectations. The tools were modern, but the logic remained Victorian. Calm, measured, and respectable was the highest metric of success. This alignment of authority, chemistry, and procedure allowed dependence to flourish without recognition. The body, trained over decades to anticipate intervention, responded obediently to every administration. Pain, agitation, and restlessness no longer signaled simple discomfort. They became indicators of absence. Relief was no longer a privilege, it was expected. Tolerance increased, withdrawal intensified, and the nervous system adapted quietly, imperceptibly, and persistently. Each measured dose reinforced the pattern of obedience. Hospitals, laboratories, and pharmacies became conduits for this Victorian logic applied with modern tools. Standardization ensured that every administration appeared consistent, controlled, and above reproach. Nurses and assistants followed schedules without question. Physicians adjusted dosage according to protocols rather than observation of subtle adaptation. The system functioned with remarkable efficiency. Patients appeared calm, wards remained orderly, and authority was reinforced. The nervous system, however, was quietly learning a new rule. Calm would arrive, but only on its terms. Society, for its part, interpreted this efficiency as proof of virtue and propriety. Families observed calm children, mothers who remained composed, laborers who worked without complaint, and soldiers who returned obedient and subdued. The appearance of order was taken as evidence that medicine had succeeded. The underlying truth that chemical expectation had reshaped sensation, behavior, and need remained invisible. Compliance and calm masked the accrual of dependence. Even the emerging scientific culture reinforced this pattern. Journals and publications praised precision, purity, and reliability. The tools of modern chemistry allowed physicians to present relief as exact, predictable, and safe. Deviations, whether intolerance or craving, were attributed to individual constitution rather than the system itself. Victorian logic, trust in authority, belief in progress, confidence in measured intervention was applied to modern tools, and in doing so, dependence was concealed beneath a veneer of efficiency. In this way, the promise of relief became indistinguishable from its necessity. Modern chemistry magnified Victorian authority. Standardized dosing masked adaptation, observed calm reinforced legitimacy, and the nervous system, conditioned for obedience over generations, anticipated each intervention as a matter of course. Victorian logic remained unbroken, but its tools had changed. The body had learned what it could expect. Society applauded efficiency, and the quiet legacy of dependence marched forward, invisible, systematic, and unchallenged. The lessons of chemical relief did not end with a single lifetime. They extended, silently, across generations, woven into the fabric of expectation, propriety, and obedience. Pain, once endured as a natural signal, had been deferred. The nervous system had been taught that suffering could be managed, softened, or erased entirely. This lesson was not confined to individual experience. It was transmitted through household practice, social norms, and medical authority, embedding itself deeply into the culture of Victorian life and its successors. In the home, the cycle was simple and persistent. Mothers administered laudanum to children to quiet restlessness. Fathers, returning from labor or injury, received morphine or opium to temper fatigue. Each administration reinforced a pattern. Discomfort was not to be endured, it was to be corrected. Children observed these routines. They internalized the rhythm of chemical intervention as normative. They learned, unconsciously, that relief was available, sanctioned, and necessary. By the time they reached adulthood, expectation had been ingrained. Pain would not be accepted as natural, it would be deferred. Hospitals and clinics extended this generational instruction. Nurses followed standardized schedules, physicians calibrated doses with precision, and wards remained orderly. Patients experienced calm, compliance, and measured relief. In each interaction, the nervous system adapted. Relief, once extraordinary, became ordinary. Intervention, once exceptional, became habitual. The body was taught obedience, over time, quietly reinforced by each subsequent administration. Generations of patients entered these institutions, each learning the same lesson. Discomfort is a condition to be managed chemically, and calm is a right that must be maintained. The cultural reinforcement was equally pervasive. Society praised calm children, composed mothers, compliant laborers, and restful patients. Schools, workplaces, and households interpreted obedience as virtue. Social structures valorized function over experience, propriety over sensation. Each generation inherited not only the chemical solutions but the expectation that they would be used. What had begun as treatment became tradition. Chemical relief was normalized, legitimized, and anticipated before it was even administered. Yet the body's adaptation carried consequences invisible to authority. Tolerance deepened. The nervous system's baseline shifted. Sleep, composure, and calm became contingent upon intervention rather than self-regulation. Withdrawal, subtle at first, appeared whenever relief was absent. Dependence, initially unobserved, now threaded itself quietly through families, workplaces, and institutions. Each generation, unaware of the legacy it carried, reinforced the pattern by adhering to expectation, trusting authority, and perpetuating the administration of chemical calm. The laboratories, the pharmacies, and the physicians who provided these compounds all contributed to the continuity. Precision and standardization masked adaptation. Efficacy and compliance were celebrated, while the accumulation of dependence remained invisible. Relief was immediate and measurable. Consequence was delayed and imperceptible. In this way, pain had been deferred, not abolished. The nervous system, trained by decades of chemical intervention, now expected obedience as the default. By the end of this era, the legacy was clear. Pain had become a negotiable condition. Suffering was something to be managed rather than understood. Relief was anticipated, demanded, and reproduced. The lessons taught in parlors, wards, and laboratories had been absorbed silently by bodies, reinforced socially, and encoded into expectation. Relief had been delivered, calm had been achieved. But the cost, measured not in single events but across generations, was inscribed into the nervous system itself. Pain had been deferred, and in that deferral lay the quiet inheritance of dependence, discipline, and obedience, waiting to be recognized, yet largely unseen. The final lesson of Victorian chemical intervention was not recorded in journals, nor announced in public, nor celebrated in society's polite circles. It was whispered, faint and insistent, in the bodies of those who had been trained to obey quietly, systematically, and across generations. Relief had been achieved, calm had been delivered, pain had been deferred, but the cost, subtle yet profound, remained. It existed in the nervous system itself. Decades of laudanum, morphine, and heroin had taught the body a new baseline. Restlessness, agitation, and discomfort were no longer simply transient signals. They became urgent indicators demanding chemical intervention. Sleep, once regulated by natural cycles, had come to depend on external administration. Calm, once earned through endurance or circumstance, had become a right to be delivered, anticipated, and expected. The body had learned obedience. The mind had learned reliance. The cost was also social. Families, workplaces, and institutions celebrated compliance and efficiency, without recognizing the adaptation that underlay it. Children who slept obediently under chemical guidance grew into adults whose first instinct was to reach for relief. Mothers who had administered tinctures and syrups to sustain household order passed the pattern to their children, often unconsciously. Soldiers returning from war, steadied by morphine, carried expectation into civilian life. The very structure of society had internalized chemical mediation as a solution, embedding dependence within the rhythms of everyday life. Even medicine itself remained blind. Physicians, confident in dosage, charting, and authority, interpreted calm as evidence of efficacy. Outward compliance, measured in wards and clinics, was indistinguishable from internal reliance. Tolerance, adaptation, and subtle withdrawal were folded into observation, rationalized as sensitivity, frailty, or disease progression. The system rewarded visible calm and ignored invisible consequence, reinforcing both the patient's expectation and the practitioner's confidence. This cost was cumulative. Each dose reinforced the previous lesson. Relief could be summoned at will, and obedience was rewarded. Each patient became a participant in a cycle whose consequences extended beyond their individual experience. Dependence, normalized, multiplied quietly, generation by generation. Social structures, family patterns, and professional authority perpetuated it. Chemical calm became both a measure of propriety and a mechanism of control. The lesson extended beyond pain and nerves. It touched behavior, emotion, and expectation. Emotional flattening, irritability between doses, and reliance upon intervention became invisible constants. The nervous system, trained over decades, anticipated relief before discomfort could fully manifest. Autonomy over sensation and endurance had been ceded. The quiet that society prized was purchased at the cost of adaptation, expectation, and reliance. Victorian science and society had achieved what they believed to be triumph: the elimination of disturbance, the orchestration of calm, the management of nerves, pain, and grief. But the body, trained and conditioned, carried a silent inheritance. Relief, immediate and measurable, had rewritten expectation. Calm had been delivered, but dependence had been instilled. The cost was real, pervasive, and largely invisible. In the end, the promise of chemical comfort had a shadow: the bottles, the syringes, the prescriptions they had taught obedience, the wards, parlors, and factories they had taught expectation. And the nervous system, across generations, had learned to rely. Victorian medicine had mastered the appearance of care. It had subdued suffering. It had delivered quiet. But the cost of that quiet would echo long beyond gaslit wards, polished parlors, and measured doses. And it would take generations to reckon with the inheritance left behind.